You made yourself the executioner. Your childhood trauma does not override the lives you extinguished. In the eyes of this court, your life is worthless. You are sentenced to life in prison without parole.
3 bodies lay decomposing in an upscale Aspen, Colorado home for 36 hours, while the person who shot them played video games just rooms away. On September 16, 2002, retired banker Gerald Hoffman peered through the living room window of the Wilson Martinez residence on Snowmass Creek Road and saw what appeared to be a leg extended at an unnatural angle from behind the leather sectional sofa. On the hardwood floor nearby, a dark stain that looked sickeningly like dried blood spread across the expensive flooring. The discovery would reveal that 42-year-old executive Ryan Wilson, his 38-year-old wife Patricia Martinez Wilson, and their 9-year-old son Michael had all been shot to death in their own home, while the only survivor, 13-year-old Dylan Martinez, remained inside the house doing nothing to alert authorities or seek help. Gerald Hoffman's 911 call came in at 9:47 a.m. on September 16, 2002, his voice shaking as he described what he'd seen to the dispatcher. Within 6 minutes, 2 Aspen Police Department patrol units arrived at the scene, followed quickly by Detective Patrick Phillips, a 15-year veteran of the force who had worked everything from high-profile burglaries targeting wealthy seasonal residents to the occasional domestic dispute that turned ugly. Phillips was a methodical investigator, known for his ability to reconstruct crime scenes with almost obsessive attention to detail. And as he approached the front door of the Wilson Martinez home that morning, he had no idea he was about to step into a case that would define his career and divide a nation. The front door was unlocked, which immediately struck Phillips as odd given the wealth displayed in this neighborhood, and as he pushed it open and stepped inside, the metallic smell of blood mixed with something else, something foul and organic, hit him like a physical wall. Before we go any further into this story, I want to ask you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, because we're going to be diving deep into one of the most controversial cases in American legal history, and you won't want to miss a single detail. Also, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from, because this case sparked a nationwide debate that's still raging today. The scene inside the Wilson Martinez home was a tableau of horror that seemed impossibly at odds with the home's expensive furnishings and carefully chosen decor. Ryan Wilson, 42, a senior executive at a Denver-based energy consulting firm, lay face down behind the sofa where Gerald Hoffman had spotted him, a single gunshot wound to the back of his head that had created a massive exit wound through his face. His wife, Patricia Martinez Wilson, 38, a former elementary school teacher who had left her career to homeschool their blended family, was sprawled in the hallway leading to the bedrooms, 2 gunshot wounds visible in her back, and a third that had entered the base of her skull. The couple's 9-year-old son, Michael Wilson, was found in his bedroom, still tucked under his Star Wars comforter, a single gunshot wound to his temple, suggesting he'd been killed in his sleep. Detective Phillips moved through the house with growing disbelief, documenting each body's position, noting the lack of defensive wounds on any of the victims, observing that Ryan Wilson's wallet with $340 in cash sat untouched on the kitchen counter next to his Rolex watch. What struck Phillips most profoundly as he continued his initial walkthrough was the eerie normalcy of everything else in the house. The kitchen showed no signs of a struggle. The television in the living room was on, but muted, displaying a paused video game screen, and in the family room downstairs he found more evidence of recent activity that seemed jarringly out of place. Empty bags from McDonald's sat on the coffee table, the food containers still inside, suggesting someone had eaten 2 Big Macs, a large fry, and consumed a large Coke in the 36 hours since the estimated time of death. Video game cases were scattered across the floor. The PlayStation 2 console was warm to the touch, and on the couch sat a Nintendo Game Boy Advance, its screen dark, but the power light still faintly glowing. Phillips bagged the Game Boy as evidence, not yet understanding how this child's toy would become the single most damning piece of evidence in a case that would Genhan the American legal system to its core. As crime scene technicians began their meticulous work, photographing every angle, collecting blood spatter evidence, and dusting for fingerprints, Detective Phillips focused on the one glaring question that screamed from every corner of this house. Where was Dylan Martinez, Ryan Wilson's 13-year-old stepson from Patricia's previous marriage? The boy's bedroom, located at the far end of the upstairs hallway, was empty but showed clear signs of recent occupation. The bed was unmade, clothes were scattered on the floor, and on the desk sat a stack of textbooks and notebooks that suggested a student who took his academics seriously. Phillips found a wallet in the top desk drawer containing Dylan's student ID from Aspen Valley Middle School, $23 in cash, and a library card, but no sign of the boy himself. On the bulletin board above the desk, Phillips noticed something that made him pause. A calendar with September 14th circled in red marker, and next to it, a handwritten note that simply said, "It ends." The search for Dylan Martinez lasted exactly 14 minutes before a patrol officer found him sitting in his father's pickup truck in the detached garage. The doors locked from the inside, headphones on, listening to music on a portable CD player. The boy offered no resistance when officers broke the window and pulled him out, his expression eerily blank as he was handcuffed and placed in the back of a patrol car. Dylan was small for his 13 years, standing barely 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing perhaps 95 pounds, with shaggy brown hair that hung in his eyes and a pale complexion that suggested too many hours spent indoors. He wore a stained Metallica t-shirt, cargo shorts, and sneakers without socks, and as Detective Phillips approached the patrol car and looked through the window at this child who might be the sole survivor or the perpetrator of a triple homicide, he saw something in the boy's green eyes that chilled him. Dylan wasn't crying, wasn't asking about his family, wasn't showing any emotion at all. He simply stared straight ahead, as if watching something only he could see. Phillips made the decision to transport Dylan to Aspen Valley Hospital rather than directly to the police station, ostensibly for a medical evaluation, but also to buy time to process the scene and determine whether they were dealing with a traumatized witness or a suspect. During the 12-minute drive, Dylan spoke only once, asking the officer in a flat, emotionless voice whether he could get his Game Boy from the house because he'd been in the middle of a Pokemon battle. The officer, unsettled by the request given the circumstances, didn't respond, and Dylan lapsed back into silence, his small frame hunched against the patrol car door, his eyes never leaving the passing scenery of Aspen's tree-lined streets. At the hospital, a physician's assistant named Dr. Sarah Chen, conducted a preliminary examination and found no physical injuries on Dylan beyond some older bruising on his back and arms that appeared to be in various stages of healing, suggesting they'd occurred over a period of weeks or months rather than in a single incident. While Dylan sat in a hospital examination room under police guard, Detective Phillips returned to the Wilson Martinez home, where the forensic team had made several critical discoveries. The murder weapon, a 9mm Glock 19 registered to Ryan Wilson, was found in the master bedroom closet, wiped clean of fingerprints, but still containing 12 rounds in its 15-round magazine, suggesting 3 shots had been fired, matching exactly with the 3 bodies and their wound patterns. Gunshot residue analysis on various surfaces in the home would later show that the killings had occurred in rapid succession, likely within a 15-minute window, with Ryan Wilson shot first in the living room, Patricia shot as she emerged from the master bedroom, presumably in response to the first gunshot, and young Michael killed last in his bed. The trajectory analysis suggested a shooter of approximately 5 feet to 5 feet 4 inches in height, and the lack of any forced entry or signs of robbery pointed to someone who had access to the home and knew where Ryan Wilson kept his firearm. The timeline began to take shape as Phillips interviewed neighbors and examined phone records and digital evidence from the home. Ryan Wilson had made his last phone call at 6:23 p.m. on September 14th, speaking with a colleague about a Monday morning meeting. His voice reportedly normal, with no signs of distress. Patricia had sent her last text message at 6:41 p.m., reminding Dylan to finish his homework before playing video games, a mundane maternal instruction that would be her final communication with the outside world. The medical examiner would later estimate time of death for all 3 victims between 7:00 p.m. and 8:00 p.m. that Saturday evening, a window that aligned with the neighbors' recollections that they'd heard what might have been firecrackers or backfires around 7:30 p.m., but had thought nothing of it. For 36 hours after that, the house had been silent and dark, with no one coming or going, until Gerald Hoffman's fateful glimpse through the curtain. Detective Phillips sat in his department-issued Ford Explorer outside the Wilson-Martinez home as the sun began to set, watching technicians carry evidence bags to their van, and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. A 13-year-old boy, by all accounts a straight-A student who played chess club and volunteered at the local library, was potentially responsible for methodically executing his entire family and then calmly spending a day and a half in the house with their bodies, eating fast food, and playing video games. It didn't fit any profile Phillips had encountered in his 15 years of police work, and yet the evidence was beginning to point in only one direction. The boy had no visible injuries suggesting self-defense or a struggle. He'd been found hiding in the garage rather than seeking help. He'd asked about his Game Boy rather than his family, and most damningly, he was the only living person who'd been in that house since Saturday evening. Phillips knew that by morning he'd have to make a decision about whether to treat Dylan Martinez as a witness in protective custody or as a suspect in a triple homicide. Detective Patrick Phillips arrived at Aspen Valley Hospital at 7:15 a.m. on Tuesday, September 17th, carrying a briefcase full of preliminary forensic reports and a recording device for what he knew would be one of the most delicate interviews of his career. Dylan Martinez had spent the night in a secure pediatric room under police guard, and according to the night shift officer, the boy had slept soundly for 8 hours, eaten a full breakfast of pancakes and sausage, and asked twice if he could have his video games brought to him. Phillips found this behavior profoundly disturbing, given that Dylan had just lost his entire immediate family in a violent massacre. But he also knew that trauma could manifest in unpredictable ways, especially in children, and he needed to approach this interview with an open mind. Dr. Chen had cleared Dylan for questioning, noting that the boy showed no signs of psychosis or immediate mental health crisis, though she strongly recommended having a child psychologist present for any formal interrogation. Phillips entered the hospital room to find Dylan sitting cross-legged on the bed, still wearing the hospital gown they'd given him the night before, watching cartoons on the wall-mounted television. The boy looked even smaller in the sterile white room, his thin shoulders hunched forward, his bare feet barely reaching the edge of the mattress. When Phillips introduced himself and asked if they could talk, Dylan shrugged with apparent indifference, his eyes never leaving the television screen where Bugs Bunny was outsmarting Elmer Fudd in some slapstick routine that felt grotesquely inappropriate given the circumstances. Phillips pulled a chair close to the bed, set his briefcase on the floor, and began with the gentlest questions he could formulate, asking Dylan if he understood what had happened, if he remembered anything about Saturday night, if he was feeling scared or confused. Dylan's responses were monosyllabic and delivered in that same flat, affectless tone that had characterized his single statement in the patrol car. No, he wasn't scared. Yes, he knew they were dead. No, he didn't remember much about Saturday. Phillips probed carefully, asking Dylan to walk him through his day on September 14th, and the boy recited a timeline with the mechanical precision of someone reading from a script he'd memorized. He'd gone to school, come home around 3:30 p.m., done his homework in his room, eaten dinner alone in his room around 6:00 p.m. because he'd been grounded, and then supposedly left around 7:00 p.m. to go to his friend Marcus Bellamy's house, where he'd planned to spend the night. According to Dylan's account, he'd walked the 6 blocks to Marcus's house, spent the evening playing video games there, and hadn't returned home until late Sunday afternoon, when he'd found the front door unlocked and everyone gone, assuming they'd left for some errand without telling him. Phillips made careful notes, recognizing immediately that this alibi could be easily verified or debunked. He asked for Marcus Bellamy's contact information, and Dylan provided an address on Pine Creek Road without hesitation, his voice remaining eerily steady. But when Phillips asked why, if Dylan had found the house empty and unlocked on Sunday, he hadn't called anyone or tried to find out where his family had gone, the boy's story began to show cracks. Dylan stammered slightly, said he'd figured they were mad at him for leaving without permission, even though he'd been grounded, and had decided to just wait for them to come back. Phillips asked about the McDonald's bags in the family room, and Dylan admitted he'd gone to get food on Sunday evening, when he got hungry, paid with money from his wallet, and brought it back to the house to eat while he waited. The interview continued for another 40 minutes, with Phillips gradually increasing the pressure of his questions while maintaining a sympathetic tone. He asked about Dylan's relationship with his stepfather, Ryan, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine emotion crossed the boy's face. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists on the bedsheet, and he said that Ryan was strict and didn't understand him. Phillips asked about Patricia, and Dylan's expression softened marginally, describing her as okay sometimes, but noting that she always took Ryan's side. When asked about his 9-year-old half-brother Michael, Dylan's face went completely blank again, and he said simply that Michael was just a kid and didn't matter. This statement, delivered with such casual dismissiveness about a murdered child, sent a chill down Phillips's spine and made him certain he was no longer interviewing a traumatized witness. After the interview, Phillips immediately dispatched officers to verify Dylan's alibi by visiting Marcus Bellamy and his family. What they discovered unraveled Dylan's entire story within 2 hours. Marcus Bellamy, a 13-year-old classmate of Dylan's from Aspen Valley Middle School, confirmed that Dylan had indeed planned to come over on Saturday evening, but he'd never shown up. Marcus's mother, Janet Bellamy, stated that she'd been home all evening and would have known if Dylan had arrived, as their doorbell camera recorded all visitors. The camera footage, which she readily provided to police, showed no sign of Dylan Martinez anywhere near their property on September 14th or 15th. Furthermore, Marcus revealed that Dylan had sent him a text message at 8:52 p.m. on Saturday night, saying he couldn't make it after all because something came up at home. A message that took on sinister significance, given that it was sent more than an hour after the estimated time of death for all 3 victims. With Dylan's alibi completely demolished, Detective Phillips returned to the Wilson Martinez home, where forensic teams were conducting a more thorough search. In Dylan's bedroom, investigators found the boy's laptop computer, which had been running but in sleep mode, and its browser history revealed a series of deeply disturbing searches conducted in the weeks leading up to the murders. On August 29th, Dylan had Googled how to get away with murder. On September 3rd, he'd searched how long before a dead body smells. On September 10th, he'd looked up what happens if a kid kills someone and can a 13-year-old go to prison. These searches, meticulously documented and time-stamped, painted a picture of premeditation that contradicted any narrative of a spontaneous act or a child acting in the heat of passion during an abusive episode. Phillips also discovered a journal hidden in a shoebox under Dylan's bed, a spiral-bound notebook filled with handwritten entries dating back nearly 2 years. The entries started relatively mundane, typical adolescent complaints about school, friends, and family, but they progressively darkened over time. Dylan wrote extensively about his hatred for his stepfather Ryan, describing in vivid detail the punishments he'd endured, the belt whippings that left welts on his back, the times he'd been locked in his room for entire weekends, the constant verbal abuse that told him he was worthless and stupid and would never amount to anything. He wrote about his mother, Patricia's complicity, her refusal to intervene, her own occasional participation in the physical punishments when Ryan deemed Dylan's infraction serious enough to warrant her involvement. But what chilled Phillips to his core were the final entries, dated in early September, where Dylan's writing shifted from despair to cold calculation. The entry, dated September 7th, read, "I've thought about it every day for months. I know where the gun is. I know the house better than anyone. I could make it look like a robbery. But why bother? No one would believe someone my age could do it anyway. They always underestimate me. That's their mistake." The entry dated September 12th was even more explicit. 2 more days. "I've picked Saturday because no one will notice until Monday. I'll have time to think, to decide what to do next. Michael is the problem. He hasn't done anything to me, but he's part of them. He's Ryan's blood. If I leave him, he'll just grow up to be another Ryan, and I can't let that happen. It has to be all of them, or it doesn't work." Phillips photographed every page of this journal, recognizing that he now had documented evidence of a 13-year-old boy planning the systematic execution of his family with the cold rationality of an adult murderer. The forensic team's ballistics analysis provided additional crucial details. The 9mm Glock that had been used in the murders showed no signs of malfunction, and the grouping of the shots, all of which had been fatal or near fatal, suggested someone with at least basic familiarity with firearms. Ryan Wilson's colleagues confirmed that he'd taken Dylan to a shooting range on 3 occasions over the past year, ostensibly to teach the boy responsibility and discipline, and range records showed that Dylan had fired approximately 150 rounds during those visits, enough to develop competency, if not expertise. The trajectory analysis confirmed that the shooter had been between 5 feet and 5 feet 4 inches tall, perfectly consistent with Dylan's height, and the lack of any forensic evidence suggesting a second person in the home during the murders made it virtually impossible to construct an alternative scenario. By Wednesday, September 18th, just 48 hours after the discovery of the bodies, Detective Phillips had assembled enough evidence to make an arrest. He returned to the hospital with a warrant and a child services representative, as Colorado law required when taking a minor into custody on felony charges. Dylan was sitting in the same position Phillips had found him in on Tuesday, watching television with that same blank expression, and when Phillips read him his rights and informed him he was being charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, the boy's only response was to ask if he could finish watching his show first. The audacity of this request, the complete absence of fear or remorse, confirmed for Phillips what he'd begun to suspect. Dylan Martinez was not a traumatized child acting out of desperation. He was something far more calculating and dangerous. Dylan was transported to the Garfield County Juvenile Detention Center in Glenwood Springs, about 40 miles from Aspen, where he would be held pending trial. Under Colorado law, juveniles charged with first-degree murder could be tried as adults if the prosecution filed a motion for transfer, and given the heinous nature of the crime and the evidence of premeditation, District Attorney Robert Chen made it clear within 24 hours that his office would be seeking exactly that. The decision sparked immediate controversy, with child advocacy groups arguing that a 13-year-old brain was not developed enough to be held to adult standards of culpability, while victims' rights organizations countered that the brutality of the crime and the calculated planning demonstrated a level of sophistication that demanded adult consequences. The media descended on Aspen with the force of an avalanche, transforming the quiet resort town into a circus of satellite trucks and camera crews. The case had every element that drove national news cycles: a wealthy family, a picturesque Colorado setting, a child defendant, and the moral quandary of how to balance justice for 3 murdered people against the age of their killer. CNN ran a week-long special titled Born Evil: The Dylan Martinez Case. Fox News featured panels of experts debating whether children could be irredeemably violent. MSNBC focused on the abuse allegations, with child psychologists arguing that Dylan had been driven to murder by years of torture that the system had failed to stop. The case became a Rorschach test for America's conflicting views on crime and punishment, childhood and accountability, mercy and vengeance. Detective Phillips watched this media firestorm from his office in the Aspen Police Department, feeling increasingly disgusted by the way Dylan's story was being sanitized and weaponized for various political agendas. Yes, the boy had been abused. The evidence of that was indisputable. But Phillips had interviewed enough abuse survivors in his career to know that the vast majority of them did not respond by murdering their entire families. Dylan had made choices, calculated and deliberate choices, over a period of weeks, and those choices had resulted in 3 innocent people being executed in their own home. The notion that a 13-year-old couldn't understand that shooting someone in the head would kill them, or that killing was wrong, struck Phillips as both insulting to the intelligence of teenagers everywhere and dangerously naive about the capacity for evil that could exist at any age. The investigation took a dramatic turn on September 23, 2002, when Detective Phillips received a call from the principal of Aspen Valley Middle School. Staff members, cleaning out student lockers in preparation for a memorial service for Michael Wilson, had discovered something that they believed belonged to the deceased 9-year-old and wanted to return it to his family. What they'd found was Michael's Game Boy Advance, a distinctive limited edition Pokemon model that Patricia Wilson had bought for her son's 9th birthday in June, sitting inside Dylan Martinez's locker, mixed in with textbooks and gym clothes. The principal, a veteran educator named Dr. Karen Steinberg, had immediately recognized the significance of this discovery and had called police before touching the device, preserving it as potential evidence. Phillips rushed to the school and personally retrieved the Game Boy, handling it with latex gloves and immediately bagging it as evidence. Even before forensic analysis, the implications were staggering. If this was indeed Michael's Game Boy, and if Dylan had it in his possession, it meant the boy had not only killed his 9-year-old half-brother, but had taken the child's toy as some kind of trophy, or had been playing with it in the aftermath of the murders. The casual cruelty of this, the idea of a 13-year-old shooting his little brother and then entertaining himself with the victim's belongings, painted a picture of sociopathic detachment that Phillips had never encountered in a juvenile case. The forensic analysis of the Game Boy Advance took 3 days and yielded evidence that would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. The device was definitively confirmed as belonging to Michael Wilson through serial number records and Patricia's credit card receipt from the purchase. More critically, the saved game data on the Pokemon cartridge inside the device contained timestamps that created an irrefutable digital trail. The last saved game file was timestamped at 8:47 p.m. on September 14, 2002, approximately 1 hour and 17 minutes after the estimated time of Michael's death. This timestamp was generated by the Game Boy's internal clock and saved automatically to the cartridge's memory chip, creating a piece of digital evidence that was as reliable as any fingerprint or DNA sample. The significance of this evidence could not be overstated. It meant that someone had been playing Michael's Game Boy Advance at 8:47 p.m. on the night of the murders, long after all three victims were dead, and that someone could only have been Dylan Martinez, the sole living person in the house. It obliterated any remaining shred of Dylan's alibi about being at Marcus Bellamy's house, and it proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Dylan had not only been present at the crime scene, but had been there for an extended period after the killings. The prosecution would later argue that the Game Boy evidence demonstrated Dylan's shocking lack of remorse, that within 80 minutes of shooting his 9-year-old half-brother in the head, he'd been sitting in that house of death playing the child's video games as if nothing had happened. Detective Phillips conducted a second interview with Dylan on September 26th, this time at the Juvenile Detention Center, with Dylan's court-appointed attorney present. When Phillips placed the Game Boy on the table between them and asked Dylan to explain how Michael's device had ended up in his school locker, the boy's carefully maintained facade finally cracked. For the first time since his arrest, Dylan showed genuine emotion, his face flushing red, his hands trembling, his voice rising in pitch as he stammered through a series of contradictory explanations. First, he claimed he didn't know how it got there. Then he said Michael must have put it there before he died. Then he said he'd found it on the floor and taken it to school to keep it safe. Then, finally, he fell silent and refused to answer any more questions. The attorney, a public defender named Sarah Mendoza, who specialized in juvenile cases, immediately recognized how damaging this evidence was and requested a recess. She spent the next hour in a private conference with Dylan, and when they returned, she made a statement that Phillips would remember for the rest of his career. Mendoza acknowledged that Dylan had been in the house on the night of the murders, that he had witnessed the deaths of his family members, but she insisted that he had not been the one who pulled the trigger. According to this new version of events, an intruder had broken into the Wilson Martinez home, murdered all three family members, while Dylan hid in his room terrified, and the intruder had then left without harming Dylan because the boy had remained hidden and silent throughout the attack. Phillips listened to this explanation with barely concealed incredulity. When he pressed Mendoza on the details, asking why this mysterious intruder would have left Dylan alive, why there was no forced entry, why nothing was stolen, why Dylan had never mentioned an intruder in any of his previous statements, and most critically, why Dylan would have taken his murdered brother's Game Boy if he was so traumatized by the attack, Mendoza had no satisfactory answers. She fell back on the argument that Dylan was a child, that he'd been in shock, that his inconsistent statements were the result of trauma rather than deception. But Phillips knew, and Mendoza knew, and Dylan sitting silently at that table knew, that this new story was a desperate attempt to reconcile the Game Boy evidence with some narrative that didn't involve a 13-year-old boy systematically murdering his family. The forensic team conducted additional analysis on the Game Boy that provided even more damning details. Fingerprint analysis revealed that the device had been wiped clean of most prints, but several partial prints matching Dylan's were found on the battery compartment and the cartridge slot, suggesting he'd handled it extensively and possibly tried to clean it. The game save data showed a progression of gameplay that indicated someone had been playing for at least 2 hours on the night of September 14th, moving through several areas of the Pokemon game world and catching multiple Pokemon, a level of focused engagement that seemed impossible to reconcile with someone who'd just witnessed a triple homicide and was supposedly hiding in fear. Detective Phillips returned to the Wilson Martinez home one more time, armed with this new evidence and a determination to reconstruct exactly what had happened on that Saturday evening. He walked through the house step by step, using the forensic reports and the timeline established by the medical examiner, and pieced together a sequence of events that was as methodical as it was horrifying. Dylan had waited until just after 7 p.m. when he knew dinner would be over and the family would be settling in for the evening. He'd retrieved his stepfather's Glock from the master bedroom closet, where Ryan kept it in a lockbox whose combination Dylan had learned by watching his stepfather open it dozens of times over the years. He'd walked into the living room where Ryan was watching television and shot him once in the back of the head from a distance of approximately 4 feet, the shot entering just below the skull and exiting through his face, killing him instantly. Patricia, hearing the gunshot from the master bedroom where she'd been folding laundry, had emerged into the hallway, and Dylan had shot her twice in the back as she tried to run, the first shot puncturing her lung and the second severing her spinal column, dropping her to the floor, where he'd delivered the third and final shot to the base of her skull to ensure she was dead. Finally, Dylan had walked to Michael's bedroom, where the 9-year-old was already asleep, exhausted from a day of playing soccer with friends, and had shot the child once in the temple at point-blank range, the muzzle of the gun leaving powder burns on Michael's skin that indicated the barrel had been pressed directly against his head. 3 shots, 3 victims, executed in approximately 8 minutes, based on the blood spatter patterns and the positions of the bodies. After the killings, Dylan had methodically wiped down the Glock to remove his fingerprints and returned it to the master bedroom closet, attempting to make it look like someone else had taken it and replaced it. He'd then spent the next several hours in the house, apparently trying to decide what to do next. At some point during those hours, he'd gone into Michael's room, stepped over his half-brother's body, and taken the Game Boy Advance from the nightstand where the boy always kept it. He'd returned to the family room, sat on the couch surrounded by the bodies of his murdered family, and played Pokémon for at least 2 hours, saving his game at 8:47 p.m. when he'd caught a rare Pikachu variant that he'd been hunting for weeks. The psychological profile of a child who could commit such acts and then calmly play video games in a house full of corpses was deeply disturbing to everyone involved in the investigation. Dr. Michael Jennings, a forensic psychiatrist brought in to evaluate Dylan, spent 6 hours interviewing the boy and reviewing all available evidence. His report, which would later become a crucial part of the trial, diagnosed Dylan with severe PTSD from years of abuse, major depressive disorder, and signs of dissociative episodes where he appeared to disconnect from reality as a coping mechanism. But Dr. Jennings also noted that Dylan showed a concerning lack of empathy and inability or unwillingness to recognize the permanence of death or the suffering he'd caused, and a tendency to rationalize his actions as justified responses to the abuse he'd endured. The case against Dylan Martinez was now overwhelming. Police had the murder weapon, the premeditation evidence from his internet searches and journal entries, the debunked alibi, the Game Boy with its damning timestamp, and a confession of sorts in his admission that he'd been in the house when the murders occurred. District Attorney Robert Chen filed formal charges of 3 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances of lying in wait, and multiple victims, and simultaneously filed a motion to transfer Dylan's case from juvenile court to adult court. The motion argued that the calculated nature of the crimes, the evidence of extensive planning, and the lack of any mitigating factors such as impaired judgment or diminished capacity justified treating Dylan as an adult despite his age. The transfer hearing, scheduled for October 15, 2002, would become the first major legal battle in a case that was already consuming the nation's attention. Child advocacy organizations filed amicus briefs arguing that no 13-year-old should be tried as an adult regardless of the crime, citing brain development research showing that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and long-term planning, was not fully developed until the mid-20s. The prosecution countered with its own expert testimony showing that Dylan's planning and execution of the murders demonstrated cognitive abilities well beyond his years. and that his age should not shield him from the consequences of choices he'd made with full awareness of their gravity. Detective Phillips attended the transfer hearing as the lead investigator, prepared to testify about the evidence his team had assembled. As he sat in the courtroom gallery watching Dylan Martinez being led in, wearing an orange juvenile detention jumpsuit that was several sizes too large for his small frame, Phillips felt a complex mix of emotions that he struggled to reconcile. On one hand, he felt deep sympathy for the abuse this boy had endured, abuse that was documented in 4 years of child services reports that detailed beatings, confinement, verbal abuse, and systematic dehumanization at the hands of Ryan Wilson and Patricia Martinez Wilson. On the other hand, he thought of Michael Wilson, a 9-year-old child who'd done nothing to Dylan, who'd been sleeping peacefully in his bed when his 13-year-old half-brother had pressed a gun to his temple and executed him. The image of that crime scene, of that small body still tucked under his Star Wars comforter, haunted Phillips in a way that 15 years of police work had never prepared him for. The transfer hearing began on October 15, 2002, in Garfield County District Court, before Judge Harold Weinstein, a 62-year-old jurist known for his careful deliberation and deep knowledge of juvenile law. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, legal observers, and members of the public who'd been lucky enough to secure one of the limited seats available. Dylan sat at the defense table, flanked by his attorneys Sarah Mendoza and a newly added criminal defense specialist named Thomas Brennan, a high-profile Denver lawyer who'd agreed to take the case pro bono after being contacted by the ACLU. The boy looked even smaller in the formal courtroom setting, his thin wrists poking out from the sleeves of an ill-fitting suit that the public defender's office had provided, his eyes downcast, his posture slumped in apparent defeat, or perhaps calculated to evoke sympathy. District Attorney Robert Chen opened the hearing with a methodical presentation of the evidence supporting transfer to adult court. He walked Judge Weinstein through the crime scene photographs, which showed the bodies of Ryan Wilson, Patricia Martinez Wilson, and 9-year-old Michael Wilson in positions that left no doubt about the violence of their deaths. Chen presented the internet search history showing Dylan's research into murder and evading detection, the journal entries documenting his planning and his disturbing rationale for killing Michael, and the Game Boy evidence with its timestamp proving Dylan's presence at the scene and his shocking lack of remorse. Chen argued that this was not a case of a child acting impulsively or in the heat of passion, but rather a methodically planned triple execution carried out by someone who understood exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. The prosecution called Detective Patrick Phillips as their first witness, and Phillips spent 3 hours on the stand describing every detail of the investigation. He testified about finding Dylan in the garage, about the boy's lack of emotion when informed of his family's deaths, about the debunked alibi, and the discovery of Michael's Game Boy in Dylan's school locker. Under cross-examination by Thomas Brennan, Phillips acknowledged that Dylan had been a victim of severe abuse, that Child Services had documented multiple instances of belt whippings and forced confinement, and that the system had failed to protect him adequately. But Phillips refused to accept Brennan's suggestion that this abuse somehow excused or explained the murders, stating firmly that millions of children suffer abuse without resorting to murder, and that Dylan had made a choice to kill rather than seek help through the numerous resources available to him. The defense's case for keeping Dylan in juvenile court rested on 2 primary arguments. First, that his brain development at age 13 made him fundamentally less culpable than an adult, and second, that the abuse he'd suffered had created psychological damage so severe that he could not be held to normal standards of moral reasoning. Dr. Jennings, the forensic psychiatrist who'd evaluated Dylan, testified about the boy's PTSD diagnosis and his dissociative episodes, He explained that Dylan's description of the night of the murders included periods where he couldn't remember his actions, suggesting that he might have been in a dissociative state when he killed his family, acting on autopilot rather than with conscious intent. Dr. Weiss Jennings acknowledged under cross-examination that this didn't change the fact that Dylan had planned the murders for weeks, but he argued that the planning itself might have occurred during lucid periods, while the actual killings happened during a dissociative break triggered by years of accumulated trauma. The defense also presented testimony from Cassandra Reed, a child services worker who'd been assigned to the Wilson Martinez family since 1998, following a report from Dylan's elementary school teacher about suspicious bruising. Reed testified with visible emotion about the 17 home visits she'd conducted over 4 years, about the reports she'd filed documenting belt marks on Dylan's back, about the times she'd found the boy locked in his room for entire weekends as punishment for minor infractions like forgetting to do a chore or getting a B instead of an A on a test. She described Patricia's defensive denials and Ryan's aggressive hostility toward her investigations, and she admitted, with tears streaming down her face, that she'd failed to protect Dylan, that the system's threshold for removing a child from a home was so high that short of witnessing abuse firsthand or finding evidence of sexual assault, her hands had been tied. One of the most powerful moments in the hearing came when the defense presented Dylan's school records and testimony from his teachers. Dylan had been a straight-A student throughout his time at Aspen Valley Middle School, a member of the chess club, a volunteer at the local library, and, by all accounts, a quiet, well-behaved child who never caused trouble. His English teacher, Mrs. Patricia Gonzalez, testified that Dylan had written several creative pieces for class that she now realized in retrospect were thinly veiled descriptions of violence and escape fantasies. One story, written in May 2002, described a boy trapped in a castle by an evil king and his queen, who eventually escapes by defeating his captors in a great battle. Mrs. Gonzalez had given the story an A for its vivid imagery and emotional depth, never recognizing it as a cry for help or a warning sign of what was to come. The prosecution countered this portrayal of Dylan as a tragic victim driven to desperate acts by presenting evidence that painted a different picture. They called witnesses who testified that Dylan had been researching murder methods as early as August, weeks before the diary entry that the defense claimed was his final breaking point. They presented evidence that Dylan had stolen $60 from his stepfather's wallet in early September and used it to take a taxi to a McDonald's on September 15th, the day after the murders, where he'd calmly ordered 2 Big Macs and eaten them in the restaurant before taking more food back to the house. The manager of the McDonald's testified that Dylan had seemed completely normal, even cheerful, chatting with the cashier about the new Pokemon game that had just been released. Perhaps most damaging to Dylan's case was the testimony about what he'd done in the 36 hours between the murders and the discovery of the bodies. Forensic analysis of the house showed that Dylan had not only played video games, but had also slept in his own bed, taken showers, eaten food from the refrigerator, and even done homework, all while his family's bodies lay decomposing throughout the house. The psychological compartmentalization required to function normally in such an environment suggested to prosecutors not trauma or dissociation, but rather cold-blooded detachment that was more characteristic of adult psychopaths than traumatized children. Judge Weinstein took the transfer motion under advisement and announced that he would issue a ruling within 30 days after reviewing all the testimony and evidence. Those 30 days felt like an eternity to everyone involved in the case. The media coverage intensified, with legal experts endlessly debating the merits of the transfer on every major news network. Child advocacy groups held rallies outside the courthouse demanding that Dylan be kept in the juvenile system where he could receive treatment and potentially be rehabilitated. Victims' rights organizations held counter-rallies demanding that justice for Ryan, Patricia, and Michael Wilson require adult prosecution and adult punishment. Dylan's surviving family members were few and deeply divided on the question of how he should be charged. His paternal grandmother, Eleanor Martinez, a 68-year-old retired schoolteacher from New Mexico, had emerged as Dylan's most vocal defender. She'd known about the abuse Dylan suffered, had tried repeatedly to intervene, and had even offered to take custody of him. But Patricia had refused to allow it, and Ryan had threatened to cut off all contact if Eleanor continued to interfere in their parenting. Eleanor sat through every day of the transfer hearing, clutching a photograph of Dylan at age 7, before Ryan Wilson had entered his life, back when he'd been a happy, smiling child who loved drawing and animals and had dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. On the other side of the courtroom sat Ryan Wilson's brother, Marcus Wilson, a 45-year-old attorney from Denver who'd lost not only his brother, but his 9-year-old nephew in the massacre. Marcus gave a statement to the press outside the courthouse that crystallized the prosecution's position. "My nephew Michael was 9 years old. He never hurt anyone in his life. He loved soccer and Star Wars and video games. Dylan killed him while he slept, shot him in the head, and then stole his Game Boy and played with it for hours. I don't care what Dylan suffered. Nothing justifies what he did to that innocent child. He needs to be tried as an adult, and he needs to spend the rest of his life in prison." On November 12, 2002, Judge Weinstein issued his ruling transferring Dylan Martinez's case to adult court. The 47-page decision methodically addressed each of the defense's arguments and found them insufficient to overcome the severity of the crimes and the evidence of premeditation. Weinstein acknowledged that Dylan had suffered terrible abuse and that the child services system had failed him, but he concluded that these factors could be considered as mitigating circumstances during sentencing if Dylan was convicted, not as reasons to treat him differently than any other defendant charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The judge wrote, "The victims in this case deserve justice, and justice cannot be denied simply because their killer is young. Dylan Martinez planned these murders, executed them with shocking efficiency, and showed no remorse in their aftermath. The juvenile system is designed for rehabilitation, but it is not equipped to address the kind of calculated violence we see here." The ruling meant that Dylan would now face trial in adult court with adult penalties if convicted, including the possibility of life in prison without parole. The decision sent shockwaves through the juvenile justice community and sparked renewed debate about the wisdom of trying children as adults for any crime. Legal scholars pointed out that the United States was virtually alone among developed nations in allowing such prosecutions, and that brain science overwhelmingly showed that adolescents lacked the judgment and impulse control of adults. But public opinion, particularly in Colorado, remained firmly in favor of adult prosecution, with polls showing that 73% of state residents believed Dylan should be tried as an adult. Dylan's defense team immediately filed an appeal of the transfer decision, but under Colorado law, the appeal would not halt the trial proceedings. District Attorney Robert Chen wasted no time in filing formal charges in adult court. 3 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances of lying in wait, multiple victims, and a victim under the age of 12. Each count carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison, and Chen made it clear that he would be seeking life without the possibility of parole, the harshest sentence available under Colorado law. The trial was scheduled for March 3, 2003, giving both sides just under 4 months to prepare. The defense team expanded to include 2 additional attorneys and a team of psychologists and social workers who would help construct a mitigation case focusing on Dylan's abuse and mental health issues. The prosecution assembled its own team of experts, including forensic psychologists, who would testify that Dylan's capacity for planning and deception demonstrated sophisticated cognitive abilities inconsistent with claims of diminished capacity or inability to understand his actions. In the months leading up to trial, Dylan remained in the Garfield County Juvenile Detention Center, though he was now segregated from the general juvenile population due to the severity of his charges and concerns about his influence on other detainees. Staff reports indicated that Dylan had adapted well to the routine of detention, participating in educational programs, reading extensively, and showing none of the behavioral problems that characterized most juvenile murder defendants. He rarely spoke about his case or his family, and when he did, it was in the same flat, emotionless tone that had characterized his interviews with Detective Phillips. The detention center's psychologist, Dr. Amanda Torres, noted in her reports that Dylan seemed to view his situation as an intellectual puzzle to be solved rather than a trauma to be processed, an observation that both fascinated and disturbed her. The case continued to dominate headlines as the trial date approached, with every new revelation about Dylan's abuse or his crimes being dissected and debated by a public that seemed unable to reconcile the image of a 13-year-old child with the brutality of what he'd done. One particularly influential article in the New York Times profiled both Dylan and his victims, humanizing all four of the people at the center of this tragedy and forcing readers to confront the uncomfortable reality that there were no simple answers, no clear villains and heroes, only a constellation of failed systems, terrible choices, and irreversible consequences that had left 3 people dead and a 13-year-old facing life in prison. Prosecutor Amanda Fisher had spent the past 4 months since Judge Weinstein's transfer ruling constructing what she believed to be an airtight case for first-degree murder. Fisher, a 38-year-old graduate of Stanford Law School who'd cut her teeth in the Denver DA's office before moving to the smaller Garfield County office, had prosecuted 23 murder cases in her career, but none had prepared her for the unique challenges of putting a 13-year-old on trial for killing his family. She knew that her case would hinge not just on proving that Dylan Martinez had pulled the trigger, which the evidence made undeniable, but on demonstrating to a jury that he'd done so with the premeditation and malice aforethought required for first-degree murder convictions. Fisher's strategy centered on 3 evidentiary pillars that she believed would overcome any sympathy the jury might feel for Dylan's age or his history of abuse. The first pillar was the digital evidence, the internet search history showing Dylan researching murder methods and legal consequences, the journal entries documenting his planning and his chilling rationale for killing Michael, and most critically, the Game Boy Advance with its 8:47 p.m. timestamp, proving that Dylan had been calmly playing video games barely an hour after executing his 9-year-old half-brother. The second pillar was the forensic evidence establishing that the murders had been carried out with shocking efficiency, 3 victims killed with 3 shots in a span of minutes, suggesting practiced aim and deliberate targeting rather than panicked firing. The third pillar was Dylan's behavior in the 36 hours after the murders. The McDonald's trip, the video game playing, the sleeping and eating and functioning normally in a house full of decomposing bodies, all of which demonstrated a level of psychological compartmentalization that Fisher would argue was inconsistent with a traumatized child acting in desperate self-defense. To support her premeditation theory, Fisher had assembled a timeline that began not on September 14, 2002, but on August 29th, when Dylan's first Google search for "how to get away with murder" appeared in his browser history. She would call expert witnesses to testify that this search history showed a sustained pattern of planning over 17 days, more than enough time for Dylan to have sought help through teachers, counselors, police, or his grandmother Eleanor, if his intent had truly been to escape his abusive home rather than to commit murder. Fisher had obtained records from Dylan's school showing that he'd had access to a guidance counselor who made herself available every day during lunch, that he'd been alone in the counselor's office on at least 4 occasions in September for routine check-ins about his academic performance, and that he'd never once mentioned the abuse or asked for help. Fisher had also secured testimony from the McDonald's manager and employees who'd served Dylan on September 15th, the day after the murders. Their descriptions of his demeanor, his casual conversation, his apparent normalcy would be devastating to any defense claim that Dylan had been in a dissociative state or overcome with trauma. The manager, Robert Hendricks, would testify that Dylan had joked with the cashier about school starting soon, had mentioned that he was excited about the new Pokemon game, and had seemed like any other teenager enjoying a weekend afternoon. This evidence of Dylan's ability to present a completely normal facade just hours after committing triple murder would, Fisher believed, demonstrate consciousness of guilt and calculated deception rather than the behavior of a traumatized child in shock. The prosecution's most controversial strategic decision was whether to present evidence about what Dylan had done with Michael's body after killing him. Crime scene investigators had found that after shooting the 9-year-old in his bed, Dylan had carefully retucked the Star Wars comforter around Michael's body, almost as if tucking him in for the night, a gesture that was simultaneously tender and horrifying in its implications. Fisher had debated extensively with her team about whether to present this detail to the jury, knowing it could cut either ways. It might demonstrate Dylan's complete detachment from reality, supporting a mental health defense, or it might show a macabre attempt to create a peaceful-looking scene that revealed his awareness of the wrongness of what he'd done. Ultimately, Fisher decided to present the evidence but frame it as consciousness of guilt, arguing that Dylan had tried to make Michael's death look peaceful, to assuage his own conscience, or to create a less disturbing scene if the bodies were discovered. The prosecution's expert witnesses were carefully chosen to rebut every anticipated defense argument. Dr. Richard Knowles, a forensic psychologist who had evaluated dozens of juvenile murderers, would testify that while adolescent brains are indeed less developed than adult brains in terms of impulse control, they are fully capable of understanding the permanence of death and the moral wrongness of murder by age 13. Dr. Knowles would present research showing that the vast majority of 13-year-olds who suffer even severe abuse do not resort to murder, and that Dylan's choice to kill represented a conscious decision rather than an inevitable outcome of his trauma. Dr. Knowles would also testify about the significance of Dylan's journal entries, arguing that the level of abstract reasoning and long-term planning they demonstrated was inconsistent with claims of diminished capacity or inability to appreciate consequences. Fisher had also secured testimony from a digital forensics expert, Dr. Lisa Chen, from the FBI's Cybercrimes Division, who would walk the jury through the Game Boy evidence in excruciating detail. Dr. Chen would explain how the timestamp was generated, how it was impossible to falsify without specialized equipment that Dylan didn't have access to, and what the saved game data revealed about Dylan's gameplay session on the night of the murders. The fact that Dylan had spent at least 2 hours playing Pokemon, progressing through multiple areas and catching numerous Pokemon, demonstrated a level of sustained focus and engagement that was incompatible with someone in a dissociative state or experiencing acute psychological trauma. On the victim's side of the case, Fisher faced the delicate challenge of humanizing Ryan Wilson and Patricia Martinez Wilson, despite the overwhelming evidence that they'd abused Dylan for years. She decided to focus primarily on Michael Wilson, the 9-year-old who was undeniably innocent and whose death could not be rationalized as self-defense or escape from an abuser. Fisher would call Michael's teachers, his soccer coach, his friends' parents, all of whom would testify about a happy, outgoing child who loved life and had never done anything to harm anyone, least of all his older half-brother. The prosecution would present Michael's drawings, his schoolwork, his diary entries about wanting to be best friends with Dylan and thinking his big brother was the coolest person in the world, creating a stark contrast between this innocent child and the cold-blooded calculation of his murder. Fisher's opening statement, which she'd rehearsed dozens of times in her office, would begin with the McDonald's visit. She would describe Dylan sitting in that restaurant, eating his Big Macs, chatting casually with strangers, while less than a mile away his father, stepmother, and 9-year-old brother lay dead in their home, shot by his hand less than 24 hours earlier. She would tell the jury that this case was not about whether Dylan Martinez had suffered abuse, because the evidence of that was clear and undeniable, but about whether that abuse justified or excused the methodical execution of 3 people, on one of whom was a sleeping child who'd never raised a hand against Dylan in his life. Fisher would argue that Dylan had choices every step of the way, choices to seek help instead of planning murder, choices to spare Michael even if he felt his stepfather and mother deserved death, choices to call police after the killings instead of spending 36 hours playing video games in a house full of corpses. The prosecution had also prepared for the defense's inevitable focus on the child services system's failures. Fisher would acknowledge those failures, but argue that they did not transfer culpability from Dylan to the state. She would point out that Eleanor Martinez, Dylan's grandmother, had offered to take custody of him multiple times, that Dylan knew he had this escape route available, and that he'd chosen murder instead of simply running away to his grandmother's home in New Mexico. Fisher would present evidence that Dylan had his grandmother's phone number memorized, that they'd spoken on the phone as recently as September 10th, just 4 days before the murders, and that Eleanor had explicitly told Dylan during that call that her door was always open if he needed to leave his stepfather's house. One of Fisher's most powerful pieces of evidence was Dylan's own words from his journal, specifically the entry from September 12th, where he'd written about Michael. "He's part of them. If I leave him, he'll just grow up to be another Ryan, and I can't let that happen." Fisher would argue that this statement revealed Dylan's true motive, which was not self-defense or escape, but rather a twisted sense of justice and control. Dylan hadn't just wanted to end his own abuse, he'd wanted to prevent any future possibility of Michael growing up to be like his father, a rationale that demonstrated premeditated malice and a complete disregard for Michael's autonomy and potential as a human being. The prosecution had identified 27 witnesses they planned to call during their case in chief, including Detective Phillips, the medical examiner, forensic experts, school personnel, and members of the community who'd interacted with Dylan before and after the murders. Fisher estimated her case would take 3 weeks to present, knowing that the defense would aggressively cross-examine every witness and challenge every piece of evidence. She'd prepared her witnesses extensively, conducting mock cross-examinations to prepare them for the defense's likely attacks on their credibility and their conclusions. Fisher had also given careful thought to the visual presentation of evidence, knowing that the jury would need to see the crime scene and understand its layout to fully appreciate the deliberate nature of the murders. She'd worked with a graphics specialist to create a 3D model of the Wilson Martinez home that would allow jurors to virtually walk through the house, seeing where each victim was killed and understanding the sequence of events. The model would show that Dylan had moved methodically from room to room, that he'd had to make conscious decisions about where to go and whom to shoot next, that this was not a single impulsive act, but rather a progression of separate choices made over an 8-minute period. The most emotionally difficult aspect of Fisher's case preparation had been deciding how graphic to make the presentation of the victim's injuries. She had crime scene photographs that showed in stark detail what a 9mm bullet does to a human skull at close range, but she knew that showing such images of a 9-year-old child could backfire, causing jurors to shut down emotionally or to resent the prosecution for forcing them to see something so horrific. Fisher decided on a compromise approach. She would show the photographs to the medical examiner during testimony, but would not project them on screens for the entire courtroom to see, allowing the jury to view them if they chose, but not forcing the images on them in a way that might seem exploitative. As the trial date approached, Fisher felt confident in her case, but deeply aware of the unprecedented nature of what she was attempting. No prosecutor in Colorado history had successfully obtained a life without parole sentence for a 13-year-old defendant, and the appellate courts would scrutinize every aspect of the trial for errors that could justify overturning a conviction. Fisher knew that she was not just prosecuting Dylan Martinez, she was setting precedent that would affect how juvenile murder cases were handled in Colorado for decades to come. The weight of that responsibility sometimes kept her awake at night, but she remained convinced that justice for Ryan Wilson, Patricia Martinez Wilson, and especially for 9-year-old Michael Wilson required that Dylan be held fully accountable for the choices he'd made on September 14, 2002. The trial of Dylan Martinez began on March 3, 2003 in Garfield County District Court before Judge Marcia Hardin, who'd been specially assigned to the case due to Judge Weinstein's retirement the previous month. Hardin, a 55-year-old former prosecutor with a reputation for running a tight courtroom and having little patience for legal gamesmanship, had presided over numerous high-profile cases during her 12 years on the bench, but nothing approaching the complexity and national attention of this trial. The jury selection process had taken 5 grueling days, with both sides exercising numerous peremptory challenges to shape a panel of 12 jurors and 4 alternates who could put aside their preconceptions about child defendants and focus solely on the evidence. The courtroom was packed to capacity on opening statements day, with overflow crowds gathered outside watching the proceedings on monitors that the court had set up to accommodate public interest. Dylan sat at the defense table between his attorneys Sarah Mendoza and Thomas Brennan, wearing a dark blue suit that had been tailored to fit his small frame, his hair recently cut, his expression carefully neutral. His grandmother Eleanor sat in the front row of the gallery directly behind him, her hands clutched together in prayer, her eyes red from crying. On the opposite side of the courtroom, Marcus Wilson sat with other family members of the victims, including Ryan's elderly parents who'd flown in from Florida, their faces showing the toll of the past 6 months of grief and waiting. Prosecutor Amanda Fisher stood and approached the jury box, making eye contact with each of the 12 jurors before beginning her opening statement. She spoke without notes, her voice clear and steady, painting a picture of September 15, 2002, when Dylan Martinez walked into a McDonald's on Main Street in Aspen, ordered 2 Big Macs, and casually chatted with the staff about the upcoming school year. She described how Dylan had seemed completely normal, even cheerful, how he'd joked with the cashier about being excited for the new Pokemon game, how he'd eaten his meal without any sign of distress or anxiety. Then Fisher paused, letting the silence build before telling the jury that at that very moment, less than a mile away, Dylan's father, stepmother, and 9-year-old half-brother lay dead in their home, murdered by Dylan's hand less than 24 hours earlier. Fisher spent the next 40 minutes methodically walking the jury through the evidence they would hear. She described the crime scene, the 3 bodies positioned exactly where they'd fallen, the forensic evidence showing 3 shots fired with deadly accuracy, the lack of any signs of struggle or self-defense. She explained the timeline of the murders, how Dylan had waited until just after 7 p.m., when the family was settling in for the evening, how he'd executed each victim in turn with chilling efficiency. She presented the internet search history showing Dylan's weeks of planning, the journal entries revealing his cold calculation about needing to kill Michael to prevent him from growing up to be like his father, and most damningly, the Game Boy Advance with its 8:47 p.m. timestamp proving that barely an hour after shooting his 9-year-old half-brother in the head, Dylan had been sitting in that house playing Pokemon. Fisher acknowledged that the jury would hear evidence about Dylan's abuse, about the belt whippings and the forced confinement and the verbal cruelty he'd endured for years. But she argued that abuse, however terrible, did not justify murder, and that millions of children suffer abuse without resorting to killing their families. She told the jury about Eleanor Martinez, Dylan's grandmother, who'd offered repeatedly to take Dylan into her home, who'd given him her phone number and told him he could call any time, day or night, if he needed help. Fisher argued that Dylan had choices, that he could have run away, called police, told teachers, gone to his grandmother's house, but instead he'd chosen to plan and execute a triple murder with the same careful deliberation he brought to his schoolwork and his chess games. The emotional climax of Fisher's opening came when she talked about Michael Wilson. She showed the jury a photograph of the 9-year-old smiling in his soccer uniform, his whole life ahead of him, and she read from Michael's diary entry from September 10th, 2002, where he'd written, "Dylan is the best big brother ever. He helped me with my math homework today, and he promised to teach me how to play Pokemon. I hope when I grow up I can be smart like him." Fisher's voice broke slightly as she described how 4 days after writing those words, Michael Wilson was shot in the head while he slept, killed by the big brother he'd admired and trusted. And she told the jury that nothing Dylan had suffered justified or explained the deliberate murder of this innocent child. Defense attorney Thomas Brennan's opening statement took a dramatically different approach, beginning not with the murders, but with Dylan's birth and the early years of his life before Ryan Wilson entered the picture. Brennan described a happy child, bright and curious, raised by a loving single mother who worked hard to provide for her son. He showed the jury photographs of young Dylan smiling at his 5th birthday party, proudly displaying a drawing he'd made in kindergarten, playing with his mother at a park. Then Brennan described how everything changed when Patricia met Ryan Wilson in 1998, how Ryan's initial charm gradually gave way to controlling behavior, verbal abuse, and eventually physical violence that targeted Dylan specifically, while sparing Ryan's biological son, Michael. Brennan spent 45 minutes detailing the abuse Dylan had suffered, reading from Child Services reports that documented belt marks, bruises in various stages of healing, and instances of confinement in Dylan's room for days at a time. He presented evidence that Dylan had been denied food as punishment, forced to do grueling physical exercise until he collapsed, subjected to constant verbal abuse that told him he was worthless and stupid and would never amount to anything. Brennan described a pattern of escalating violence that had been documented by teachers, counselors, and child services workers, all of whom had filed reports that went nowhere because the system's threshold for removing a child from a home was so impossibly high that Dylan's suffering was deemed insufficient to warrant intervention. The defense opening focused heavily on the psychological impact of this abuse, with Brennan explaining that the jury would hear from experts about PTSD, dissociative episodes, and the ways prolonged trauma literally changes the structure of a developing brain. He argued that on September 14, 2002, Dylan had reached a breaking point after his father discovered his diary and beat him so severely that he couldn't sit down for days after Ryan had told him that the suicidal thoughts Dylan had written about were just proof of his weakness, that real men didn't whine about their problems. Brennan portrayed the murders not as premeditated executions, but as the desperate, dissociative act of a child whose mind had fractured under years of unbearable pressure. Brennan addressed the Game Boy evidence directly, arguing that Dylan's behavior in the hours after the murders was exactly what one would expect from someone in a severe dissociative state. He explained that dissociation is a protective mechanism the mind uses when confronted with unbearable trauma, allowing someone to function mechanically while their conscious awareness shuts down. The fact that Dylan could play video games and eat McDonald's, Brennan argued, didn't prove coldness or lack of remorse. It proved that his mind had broken so completely that he was operating on autopilot, going through familiar motions because his psyche couldn't process what had happened. The defense opening concluded with a direct appeal to the jury's humanity, with Brennan asking them to look at Dylan, really look at this small 13-year-old boy, and ask themselves whether it served justice or society to lock him away forever. Brennan argued that Dylan was not beyond redemption, that with proper treatment and counseling, he could one day understand and take responsibility for what he'd done. But that path to redemption would be impossible if he was thrown away in an adult prison for the rest of his life. He reminded the jury that their job was not to decide what should happen to Dylan, only whether he was guilty of first-degree murder with premeditation. And he argued that the evidence would show Dylan's actions were the product of severe mental illness and trauma rather than the cold calculation required for that charge. Judge Hardin called a 15-minute recess after opening statements, and the courtroom erupted in whispered conversations as spectators processed what they'd heard. The contrast between Fisher's methodical, evidence-focused presentation and Brennan's emotional appeal to sympathy and mitigation had laid out the battle lines for a trial that everyone knew would be as much about philosophy and morality as about facts and law. When court reconvened, Fisher called her first witness, Detective Patrick Phillips, who would spend the next day and a half walking the jury through his investigation and the evidence he'd collected. Phillips's testimony was devastating for the defense as he methodically presented crime scene photographs, forensic reports, and Dylan's own contradictory statements. Phillips described finding Dylan in the garage, his complete lack of affect when told about the deaths, his fabricated alibi that unraveled within hours. He walked the jury through the internet search history, explaining how he'd personally verified that the searches had been conducted on Dylan's laptop from the family's home IP address, making it impossible for anyone else to have been responsible. Phillips presented the journal, reading selected entries that showed the progression from despair to planning to cold calculation about the necessity of killing Michael. Under cross-examination, Brennan tried to shift focus to the Child Services reports and Phillips's awareness of the abuse Dylan had suffered. Phillips acknowledged that he'd reviewed all the Child Services files, that he'd seen the documentation of beatings and confinement, that he believed Dylan had been genuinely abused. But Phillips refused to accept Brennan's suggestion that this abuse somehow mitigated Dylan's culpability, stating firmly, "I've been a police officer for 16 years. I've seen hundreds of abused children. The vast majority of them grow up to be decent people who would never dream of hurting anyone. Dylan Martinez made a choice to murder his family, and he spent weeks planning that choice. His age doesn't change that, and his abuse doesn't excuse it." The testimony that most visibly affected the jury came from the medical examiner, Dr. Robert Harrison, who described the autopsy findings for each victim. When Harrison testified about Michael Wilson's wounds, explaining that the bullet had entered the child's temple at close range, traveled through his brain, and exited through the opposite side of his skull, killing him instantly while he slept, several jurors openly wept. Harrison's description of the muzzle stamp on Michael's skin, the circular bruising and powder burns that proved the gun had been pressed directly against the boy's head when fired, created a visual that no amount of testimony about Dylan's abuse could erase. Fisher's presentation of the Game Boy evidence occupied an entire day of testimony, with digital forensics expert Dr. Lisa Chen explaining in excruciating technical detail how the timestamp was generated and why it was impossible to falsify. Dr. Chen testified that the saved game data showed a progression of gameplay consistent with someone who was fully engaged and making strategic decisions, not someone in a dissociative state, mindlessly pressing buttons. She explained that Dylan had caught a rare Pokemon variant that required specific actions and timing, demonstrating focus and intentionality. When Dr. Chen displayed the Game Boy's screen on the courtroom monitors, showing the exact moment at 8:47 p.m. when Dylan had saved his game after catching a Pikachu, the courtroom fell completely silent. The prosecution's case continued for 3 weeks, with Fisher calling 23 witnesses who collectively painted a picture of methodical planning, efficient execution, and chilling lack of remorse. The McDonald's employees testified about Dylan's normal demeanor the day after the murders. Teachers testified about the counseling resources available to Dylan that he'd never utilized. Computer forensics experts testified about the breadth of Dylan's internet research into murder and legal consequences. Each piece of evidence, each witness, added another brick to the wall Fisher was building, a wall that seemed to leave no room for reasonable doubt about Dylan's guilt or the premeditated nature of his crimes. The defense case began on March 24, 2003, with Thomas Brennan calling Dr. Michael Jennings, the forensic psychiatrist who'd evaluated Dylan extensively after his arrest. Dr. Jennings testified for 6 hours over 2 days, providing the jury with a crash course in developmental psychology, trauma responses, and the specific diagnoses he'd given Dylan: severe PTSD, major depressive disorder, and intermittent dissociative episodes. Jennings explained that Dylan's brain at age 13 was still fundamentally different from an adult brain, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control, long-term planning, and moral reasoning. He argued that while Dylan intellectually understood that murder was wrong, his capacity to apply that knowledge to his own situation was severely compromised by years of abuse and the acute psychological break he'd experienced on September 14th. Dr. Jennings's most compelling testimony came when he described his interviews with Dylan and the boy's complete emotional disconnection from the events of that night. Jennings testified that when he'd asked Dylan to describe what happened, Dylan had recounted the murders in the same flat tone someone might use to describe a grocery shopping trip, showing no emotion, no recognition of the gravity of what he was saying. Jennings had conducted tests measuring Dylan's physiological responses while discussing the murders, monitoring his heart rate, skin conductivity, and other markers of emotional arousal, and had found virtually no response, suggesting either complete dissociation or a level of psychological damage so severe that Dylan's emotional responses had been entirely shut down. Under cross-examination, Amanda Fisher systematically dismantled Dr. Jennings's testimony by focusing on the timeline of Dylan's supposed dissociative break. Fisher pointed out that Dylan's internet searches about murder dated back to August 29th, weeks before the final beating that Jennings had identified as the triggering event for the dissociative episode. If Dylan was in a dissociative state on September 14th, Fisher asked, how did he explain the weeks of careful planning that preceded it? Jennings struggled to reconcile these facts, eventually falling back on a theory that Dylan had been experiencing intermittent dissociative episodes for months, during which he'd engaged in the planning while not fully conscious of what he was doing, a theory that Fisher effectively mocked as psychological double talk designed to excuse inexcusable behavior. Fisher also challenged Jennings on the Game Boy evidence, asking how someone in a severe dissociative state could engage in complex gameplay requiring strategic thinking and problem-solving. Jennings argued that video games could be played on autopilot, that the familiarity of the activity might actually be what allowed Dylan to dissociate. But Fisher presented evidence that Dylan had caught a rare Pokemon variant during his September 14th play session, an achievement that required specific timing and intentional action. How could someone dissociated from reality accomplish that? Jennings had no satisfactory answer, and Fisher's cross-examination left the clear impression that Jennings was a defense expert, saying what he'd been hired to say rather than providing objective scientific analysis. The defense called Cassandra Reed, the child services worker who'd been assigned to Dylan's case since 1998, and her testimony provided the emotional counterweight to the prosecution's focus on Dylan's crimes. Reed testified for a full day about the 17 home visits she'd conducted, the reports she'd filed documenting abuse, and her frustration with a system that tied her hands until abuse reached catastrophic levels. She described finding Dylan locked in his room on multiple occasions, seeing belt marks on his back and arms, documenting instances where he'd been denied food as punishment. Reed testified that she'd filed formal reports recommending Dylan's removal from the home on 4 separate occasions between 2000 and 2002, and that all 4 recommendations had been rejected by her supervisors, who determined that the abuse didn't meet the legal threshold for removal. Reed's testimony became emotionally charged when Brennan asked her about her last visit to the Wilson Martinez home, which had occurred on September 2, 2002, just 12 days before the murders. Reed described finding Dylan in his room, pale and withdrawn, with fresh bruises on his arms from what Ryan had described as a disciplinary session after Dylan had gotten a B on a math test. Reed had tried to interview Dylan privately, but Ryan had refused to leave the room, standing there with his arms crossed while glaring at both of them. Dylan had told Reed he was fine, that the bruises were from falling off his bike, a transparent lie that Reed knew she couldn't prove without Dylan's cooperation. Reed broke down crying on the stand as she described leaving that house knowing Dylan was being hurt, but feeling powerless to help him, and her testimony left several jurors visibly emotional. Under cross-examination, Fisher showed surprising compassion for Reed's situation, while still making the point she needed for her case. Fisher acknowledged that the child services system had failed Dylan, but she pointed out that there were other avenues Dylan could have pursued. Dylan's grandmother had offered to take him in. His school counselor was available daily. There were abuse hotlines he could have called anonymously. Fisher asked Reed directly, "If Dylan had come to you on September 13th and said he needed to leave that house immediately, what would you have done?" Reed answered honestly, "I would have found him emergency placement that same day, either with his grandmother or in foster care. All he had to do was ask." Fisher let that answer hang in the air before sitting down. The implication clear. Dylan had options other than murder. The defense presented testimony from Dylan's teachers, particularly his English teacher, Mrs. Patricia Gonzalez, who described the creative writing assignment where Dylan had written a story about a boy escaping from an evil king by defeating his captors in battle. Gonzalez testified that she'd shown this story to the school counselor after the murders, worried that she'd missed warning signs, but the counselor had told her that the story alone wasn't specific enough to warrant mandatory reporting. Gonzalez's testimony was meant to show that Dylan had been signaling his desperation in the only ways he knew how, but Fisher's cross-examination focused on the fact that in all his interactions with teachers, counselors, and other authority figures, Dylan had never once explicitly asked for help or reported the abuse. One of the most dramatic moments in the trial came when the defense called Eleanor Martinez, Dylan's paternal grandmother, to testify. Eleanor was a dignified woman in her late 60s, a retired school teacher who'd raised 4 children and helped raise numerous grandchildren. She testified about her attempts to maintain a relationship with Dylan, despite Ryan and Patricia's efforts to limit her contact, about the phone calls she'd made to child services, expressing concern about bruises she'd seen, about the standing offer she'd made to Dylan that he could come live with her in New Mexico any time he wanted. Eleanor described visiting the Wilson Martinez home in August 2002, Seeing Dylan thin and withdrawn, covered in bruises, he claimed were from sports, and begging Patricia to let her take the boy for the rest of the summer, an offer that Patricia had refused. Eleanor's testimony became wrenching when Brennan asked her to describe her relationship with Dylan before Ryan Wilson entered their lives. She talked about a happy, imaginative child who loved drawing and animals, who would spend hours creating elaborate fantasy worlds with his toy figures, who dreamed of becoming a veterinarian so he could help sick animals. She described how that bright, curious boy had gradually withdrawn into himself after Ryan and Patricia married, how his calls to her became less frequent, how his voice on the phone sounded flat and lifeless. Eleanor testified that during their last phone call on September 10th, just 4 days before the murders, Dylan had sounded different, agitated and angry, in a way she'd never heard before, and she'd asked him if everything was okay, if he wanted to come stay with her. Dylan had told her he was fine, that he had to go, and had hung up abruptly. Brennan's examination of Eleanor culminated in the moment that would become the most iconic image of the trial. He asked Eleanor if she'd brought anything with her to court, and she reached into a bag at her feet and pulled out a worn teddy bear, faded and patched, missing one eye. Eleanor testified that this was Michael Wilson's favorite toy, that the little boy had carried it everywhere, that she'd found it in Michael's room after the murders, and had kept it because she couldn't bear to throw away this last piece of her youngest grandson. Holding the teddy bear to her chest, tears streaming down her face, Eleanor looked directly at the jury and said, "I lost 2 grandsons on September 14th. I lost Michael to death, and I lost Dylan to whatever darkness consumed him. I don't know if what Dylan did can ever be forgiven, but I know that throwing him away won't bring Michael back. And it won't bring back the boy Dylan used to be before Ryan destroyed him." This testimony, with Eleanor clutching Michael's teddy bear and weeping for both her murdered grandson and her grandson accused of the murder, created a courtroom tableau that was photographed by every media outlet covering the trial. The image would appear on the front page of the New York Times, Time magazine, and countless other publications, becoming the visual representation of the impossible moral dilemma at the heart of the case. How could a society balance justice for a murdered child against mercy for the child who'd killed him? How could any punishment fit a crime that was simultaneously an atrocity and a tragedy? Fisher's cross-examination of Eleanor was brief and respectful, acknowledging the woman's grief while making one critical point. Fisher established that Dylan had Eleanor's phone number memorized, that he'd called her as recently as September 10th, that he knew her offer to take him in was genuine and standing. Fisher asked, "Mrs. Martinez, if Dylan had called you on September 13th and said he needed to leave that house immediately, would you have come to get him?" Eleanor answered without hesitation, "I would have been in my car within 5 minutes. I would have driven through the night. I would have done anything to get that boy away from Ryan." Fisher nodded and said, "And Dylan knew that, didn't he?" Eleanor, crying, whispered, "Yes." Fisher sat down, having made her point. Dylan had an escape route and had chosen murder instead. The defense's presentation of Dylan's abuse continued through testimony from school counselors, pediatricians who'd treated Dylan's injuries over the years, and neighbors who'd heard Ryan's raging voice through the walls of the Wilson-Martinez home. Each witness added to a picture of systematic, prolonged abuse that should have triggered interventions, but somehow never reached the threshold required by a system designed more to preserve families than to protect children. The cumulative effect of this testimony was powerful, creating genuine sympathy for what Dylan had endured. But Fisher's consistent cross-examination theme kept circling back to the same point. Abuse, however severe, did not justify the execution of 3 people, particularly not a sleeping 9-year-old child who'd never harmed anyone. The defense's expert testimony on brain development and adolescent psychology occupied several days, with neurologists and psychologists explaining that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and long-term consequence assessment, doesn't fully develop until the mid-20s. They presented brain imaging studies showing structural differences between adolescent and adult brains, particularly in areas governing emotional regulation and moral reasoning. The experts argued that expecting a 13-year-old to have the same judgment and self-control as an adult was neurologically impossible, that Dylan's brain was literally incapable of fully appreciating the long-term consequences of his actions on September 14th. Fisher's cross-examinations of these experts focused on the distinction between general cognitive capacity and specific moral knowledge. She established that, by age 13, virtually all children understand that murder is wrong, that killing is permanent, and that actions have consequences. Fisher pointed to Dylan's journal entries, his internet searches, his careful planning, all of which demonstrated abstract reasoning and long-term thinking that contradicted claims of cognitive incapacity. She got several experts to admit that while adolescent brains are indeed different from adult brains, the vast majority of teenagers, even those suffering severe abuse, do not commit murder, suggesting that brain development alone could not explain Dylan's actions. The final witnesses for the defense were psychologists who'd evaluated Dylan since his arrest and testified about his potential for rehabilitation. They described a boy who'd engaged productively with therapy, who'd shown capacity for insight and emotional growth, who could potentially, over years of treatment, come to understand and take responsibility for what he'd done. These witnesses argued that sentencing Dylan to life without parole would be giving up on that potential, choosing vengeance over the possibility of redemption. But Fisher's cross-examinations highlighted that none of these psychologists could guarantee Dylan's rehabilitation. None could promise that he would ever be safe to release into society, and none could explain how Michael Wilson's death would be served by allowing his killer to potentially go free someday. The presentation of the Game Boy evidence had been woven throughout the trial, but on April 7, 2003, prosecutor Amanda Fisher orchestrated a dramatic courtroom demonstration that would become the emotional and evidentiary climax of her case. Fisher had arranged for a large screen to be set up in the courtroom, and she recalled Dr. Lisa Chen, the digital forensics expert, to walk the jury through a minute-by-minute recreation of Dylan's gameplay session on the night of September 14, 2002. Dr. Chen had used the saved game data to reconstruct Dylan's exact path through the Pokemon game world, identifying each Pokemon he'd caught, each area he'd explored, each decision he'd made during those 2 hours of gameplay after the murders. Dr. Chen's testimony was accompanied by video footage showing exactly what Dylan would have seen on the Game Boy screen as he played, and the effect in the courtroom was electric. The jury watched as the timeline unfolded. At approximately 7:15 p.m., based on the medical examiner's estimates, Dylan had shot his father Ryan in the back of the head. At approximately 7:20 p.m., he'd shot his stepmother Patricia 3 times as she emerged from the bedroom. At approximately 7:23 p.m., he'd walked into Michael's room and shot his sleeping 9-year-old half-brother in the temple. And then, at some point between 7:30 p.m. and the 8:47 p.m. save timestamp, Dylan had retrieved Michael's Game Boy Advance from the dead child's nightstand, sat down in the family room, and begun playing Pokemon while his family's bodies cooled in the rooms around him. Dr. Chen explained that the progression of Dylan's gameplay showed someone who was fully engaged and making strategic decisions. He'd navigated to a specific area of the game world where rare Pokemon spawned. He'd used items from his inventory to increase his chances of encountering them. And when he'd finally encountered the rare Pikachu variant he was hunting, he'd engaged in a battle that required timing his Pokeball throws to moments when the Pokemon was weakened but not yet fainted. This level of strategic thinking, Dr. Chen testified, was inconsistent with someone in a severe dissociative state or psychological break. Dylan had been present, focused, and goal-oriented, treating the game as a challenge to be solved, while apparently giving no thought to the 3 corpses sharing the house with him. Fisher asked Dr. Chen to explain for the jury what the 8:47 p.m. timestamp meant in practical terms. Dr. Chen testified that this was the moment when Dylan had manually saved his game, pressing a specific sequence of buttons to access the save menu and confirm his save file. This wasn't an automatic process. It required deliberate action and multiple intentional button presses. Fisher asked, "So at 8:47 p.m., approximately 1 hour and 24 minutes after shooting his 9-year-old half-brother in the head, Dylan Martinez was sufficiently present and aware to navigate menu systems and make deliberate choices in a video game?" Dr. Chen answered, "Yes, that's exactly what the evidence shows." The defense's cross-examination of Dr. Chen focused on trying to establish that video games could be played habitually, that someone could go through familiar motions without conscious thought. But Dr. Chen dismantled this argument by pointing out the specific rare Pokemon Dylan had caught. She testified that encountering and successfully catching this particular Pokemon variant required Dylan to be in a specific location at a specific time, and to make specific choices during the battle. The odds of accomplishing this by random button mashing were astronomical. Dylan had succeeded because he knew what he was doing, because he was fully engaged with the game, because his mind was functioning normally enough to pursue a goal and achieve it. Fisher's closing presentation of the Game Boy evidence included showing the jury the actual device, now entered as Exhibit 47. She passed it among the jurors, allowing each of them to hold this child's toy that had become such damning evidence of Dylan's state of mind. Several jurors examined it with visible emotion, some looking from the Game Boy to Dylan sitting at the defense table, perhaps trying to reconcile the image of a small 13-year-old boy with the cold calculation required to play video games while surrounded by the family members he'd just murdered. The teddy bear that Eleanor Martinez had clutched during her testimony sat on the prosecution table just feet away from the Game Boy, the 2 objects creating a visual representation of innocence destroyed and callousness revealed. Fisher called one final witness to testify about the Game Boy evidence: Marcus Wilson, Ryan Wilson's brother, and Michael's uncle. Marcus had been present throughout the trial but hadn't testified until this moment. Brennan objected strenuously, arguing that Marcus was testifying purely for emotional impact and had no relevant factual testimony to offer, but Judge Hardin overruled the objection, noting that Marcus could testify about the significance of the Game Boy to Michael and provide context for why its use by Dylan was particularly significant. Marcus testified that he'd given Michael that limited edition Pokemon Game Boy Advance for his 9th birthday, that it had been his nephew's most treasured possession. Marcus described how Michael had carried it everywhere, how he'd saved up his allowance to buy Pokemon cartridges, how he'd spend hours playing, and then call Marcus to excitedly describe the Pokemon he'd caught. Marcus testified that just a week before his death, Michael had called him specifically to talk about the rare Pikachu variant he was hunting, saying that Dylan had told him it was in a specific area, and that Dylan had promised to help him find it. The implication was devastating. Dylan had known his little brother was hunting for this Pokemon, had apparently discussed it with him, and then, after murdering Michael, had used the boy's Game Boy to catch that very Pokemon himself. Brennan's cross-examination of Marcus tried to suggest that this testimony was speculation, that there was no evidence Dylan had been thinking about his conversations with Michael while playing the game, but Marcus wouldn't be moved from his central point. Looking directly at Dylan, his voice shaking with emotion, Marcus said, "Michael loved you. He thought you were the coolest person in the world. He looked up to you. And you shot him in the head while he slept, Then you stole his most treasured possession and played with it like nothing had happened. That's not trauma. That's not dissociation. That's evil. Judge Hardin sustained Brennan's objection to Marcus characterizing Dylan as evil, instructing the jury to disregard that comment, but the damage was done. The word hung in the courtroom air, and jurors' faces showed that they were grappling with the same question that had consumed public discourse for months. At what point did a combination of youth and trauma stop excusing behavior that seemed, by any objective measure, to be monstrous? The Game Boy sitting in evidence, Michael's cherished toy that Dylan had taken and used with apparent callousness, seemed to embody that question in physical form. The prosecution's rebuttal case, presented after the defense rested, focused on systematically refuting the claims of dissociation and diminished capacity. Fisher called Dr. Richard Knowles, her expert forensic psychologist, who testified that he'd reviewed all of Dr. Jennings's evaluations and profoundly disagreed with his conclusions. Dr. Knowles testified that Dylan's behavior showed not dissociation, but rather compartmentalization, a conscious psychological strategy where someone separates their actions from their emotions to avoid dealing with guilt or remorse. Knowles argued that dissociation is characterized by confusion, memory gaps, and inability to function in complex tasks, none of which described Dylan's gameplay, his McDonald's trip, or his general functioning in the 36 hours after the murders. Dr. Knowles presented his own evaluation of Dylan, conducted over 8 hours in the county jail, and his conclusions were far less sympathetic than Dr. Jennings's had been. Knowles testified that Dylan showed signs of narcissistic personality traits, including an inflated sense of his own intelligence and a tendency to view other people as obstacles to be managed, rather than as individuals with their own worth. Knowles described asking Dylan about Michael's death and receiving an answer that chilled him. Michael would have grown up to be like Ryan. I did him a favor. This statement, which Dylan had apparently made without any recognition of how disturbing it was, suggested to Knowles not trauma-induced dissociation, but rather a profoundly distorted moral framework that allowed Dylan to rationalize murder as a mercy. Under cross-examination, Brennan challenged Knowles's evaluation, pointing out that it had been conducted nearly 7 months after the murders, while Dr. Jennings had evaluated Dylan much closer to the events. Brennan suggested that whatever Dylan's current psychological state, it might be very different from his state on September 14th, and that Knowles's testimony about Dylan's current personality traits didn't prove what his mental state had been the night of the murders. Knowles countered that personality disorders like narcissism don't develop overnight, that the traits he'd observed would have been present long before the murders, and that they provided a much better explanation for Dylan's actions than the dissociation theory. The final rebuttal witness was a surprise. Sarah Mendoza, Dylan's original public defender, who'd been replaced by Thomas Brennan when the case went to trial, but who'd spent dozens of hours with Dylan in the immediate aftermath of his arrest. Mendoza testified, with visible reluctance and over strenuous defense objections, about a conversation she'd had with Dylan in October 2002 when he'd been trying to explain to her why he'd killed Michael. According to Mendoza, Dylan had said, "I didn't want to kill him, but I had to. If I only killed Ryan and Patricia, Michael would have told everyone what I did. He was a witness. I didn't have a choice." This statement, which directly contradicted the defense's narrative that Michael's death was an impulsive act during a dissociative episode, suggested cold, calculated reasoning about eliminating a witness. Brennan's cross-examination of Mendoza was brutal, questioning why she hadn't disclosed this statement earlier, suggesting she was testifying now only to help her reputation after dropping a high-profile case, and arguing that her interpretation of Dylan's words was skewed by her bias. But Mendoza held firm, testifying that she'd kept detailed notes of all her conversations with Dylan and that his statement was clearly documented in her files. Judge Hardin ruled the testimony admissible despite its belated disclosure, noting that Mendoza had an ethical obligation to disclose it once it became relevant to the trial. The presentation of evidence concluded on April 14, 2003, after 6 weeks of testimony from 47 witnesses and the introduction of over 200 exhibits. The case had consumed the courtroom, the media, and the nation with its impossible questions about childhood, trauma, accountability, and justice. As Judge Hardin instructed the jurors on the law they would apply during deliberations, explaining the elements of first-degree murder and the various lesser-included offenses they could consider, the weight of the decision they faced was visible on every face in the jury box. They would now have to decide whether Dylan Martinez was a traumatized child who'd broken under unbearable pressure or a calculating killer who deserved to be punished as an adult regardless of his age. The closing arguments began on April 15, 2003, with Thomas Brennan delivering an impassioned 90-minute plea for mercy that invoked everyone from William Shakespeare to modern neuroscience researchers in making the case that Dylan Martinez should not be convicted of first-degree murder. Brennan began his closing by asking the jury to really look at Dylan, to see the small, thin 13-year-old sitting at the defense table, and to remember that this was a child they were judging. He argued that society had made a collective decision centuries ago that children are fundamentally different from adults, that their judgment is impaired, their decision-making capacity limited, their potential for rehabilitation greater. That's why children can't vote, can't enter contracts, can't get married without parental consent, and can't be executed for crimes they commit. All of those legal distinctions recognize that children are not simply small adults. They are developmentally different beings whose brains are still forming and whose characters are still being shaped. Brennan walked the jury through Dylan's life chronologically, from his early happy years to the nightmare his existence became after Ryan Wilson entered the picture. He showed them photographs of a smiling 6-year-old Dylan alongside photographs of the withdrawn, hollow-eyed 13-year-old who'd been arrested, and he asked them to see the transformation that abuse had wrought. Brennan read from child services reports, from school counselor files, from pediatrician notes, all documenting years of beatings, confinement, verbal abuse, and psychological torture that multiple professionals had reported and that the system had failed to stop. He argued that Dylan had been crying out for help in every way he knew how, through his creative writing, through his depression, through his increasingly withdrawn behavior, and that every adult who should have protected him had failed. The defense closing addressed the Game Boy evidence directly, with Brennan arguing that the jury needed to understand dissociation not as an excuse, but as a scientific reality of how traumatized minds cope with unbearable events. He explained that it was precisely the familiarity and routine nature of playing Pokémon that would make it the activity Dylan's fractured mind would retreat to, that the apparent normalcy of his gameplay didn't prove coldness, but rather showed how completely his conscious mind had shut down to protect itself from what he'd done. Brennan pointed to studies showing that soldiers suffering from PTSD often describe feeling detached from their actions during combat, watching themselves do things as if from outside their bodies, and he argued that Dylan had experienced the same dissociative phenomenon. Brennan's most emotional argument came when he addressed Michael's death directly, acknowledging that this was the part of the case that seemed most difficult to justify or explain. He told the jury that he wouldn't insult their intelligence by claiming Michael's death was anything other than a tragedy, but he asked them to consider what Dylan's statement to his attorney, Sarah Mendoza, really meant. When Dylan had said he had to kill Michael because Michael was a witness, Was that the cold calculation of an adult murderer? Or was it the desperate, confused reasoning of a traumatized child who'd just killed his abusers and couldn't think clearly about what to do next? Brennan argued that a truly calculating adult would have created an alibi that worked, would have disposed of evidence, would have called police and claimed an intruder had killed his family. Dylan had done none of those things because he wasn't thinking clearly, because his 13-year-old brain was overwhelmed by what he'd done. The defense closing concluded with Eleanor Martinez's testimony and the image of her clutching Michael's teddy bear. Brennan reminded the jury of Eleanor's words, "I lost 2 grandsons on September 14th. He argued that convicting Dylan of first-degree murder and sentencing him to life without parole would be losing Dylan all over again, would be society giving up on a child who'd been failed by every system meant to protect him. Brennan asked the jury to return a verdict of second-degree murder or manslaughter, acknowledging that Dylan had killed his family, but recognizing that the circumstances of abuse, his age, and his mental state at the time made this something less than the calculated, premeditated murder that the prosecution was alleging. Amanda Fisher's closing argument was shorter but more focused, running just 75 minutes, and it systematically dismantled every aspect of the defense's case. Fisher began not with the murders but with September 15th, the day after, when Dylan Martinez had walked into a McDonald's, ordered food, joked with the cashier, and shown not the slightest sign that anything was wrong. She described this not as dissociation, but as calculated deception, a deliberate attempt to appear normal and create the impression that he was just another teenager enjoying his weekend. Fisher argued that someone truly traumatized and dissociating doesn't successfully pretend to be fine. They show signs of their distress even if they can't articulate it. Dylan had shown none of those signs. Fisher walked the jury through the timeline of premeditation, starting with the August 29th internet search for how to get away with murder, and continuing through the weeks of planning documented in Dylan's journal. She read from the September 12th entry, where Dylan had written about needing to kill Michael to prevent him from growing up to be like Ryan, and she asked the jury, "Does that sound like someone who's dissociating, or does it sound like someone who's carefully thinking through the logical consequences of his actions?" Fisher argued that every aspect of Dylan's planning showed conscious, deliberate decision-making, choosing a night when he'd have time before the bodies were discovered, learning the combination to his stepfather's lockbox where the gun was stored, researching legal consequences so he'd know what he might face if caught. The prosecution's closing addressed the abuse evidence head-on, with Fisher acknowledging that Dylan had suffered terribly, but arguing that suffering doesn't excuse murder. She pointed to statistics showing that millions of children experience abuse, that most of them grow up to be law-abiding adults who would never dream of hurting anyone, and that allowing Dylan's abuse to excuse his crimes would be implicitly suggesting that abused children are ticking time bombs, likely to become murderers. Fisher argued that this was insulting to abuse survivors everywhere and dangerous as a matter of legal policy. If abuse excused murder, she asked, where would the line be drawn? How much abuse was enough to justify killing? Who would make that determination? The law provided clear answers. Abuse was a factor to be considered during sentencing, but it didn't negate criminal responsibility. Fisher's most powerful moments came when she talked about Michael Wilson, showing the jury the photograph of the 9-year-old in his soccer uniform, reading from his diary entry about how much he admired his big brother Dylan. She described the crime scene in Michael's bedroom, the Star Wars comforter, the nightstand where the Game Boy had been, the position of Michael's small body, showing he'd been asleep when he was killed. Fisher asked the jury to imagine that moment, a 13-year-old boy walking into his sleeping half-brother's room, pressing a gun against the child's temple and pulling the trigger. She asked them, what part of that action could possibly be explained by abuse or trauma? Michael hadn't abused Dylan, Michael had loved Dylan, and Dylan had killed him anyway. Fisher addressed Dr. Jennings's dissociation testimony by pointing out all the things Dylan had successfully done while supposedly in a dissociative state, played complex video games, navigated to a McDonald's, ordered food, paid for it, ate it, had conversations with strangers, all without anyone noticing anything wrong. She argued that this wasn't what dissociation looked like according to any medical literature, that Dr. Jennings had twisted the definition of dissociation to fit Dylan's behavior, rather than objectively evaluating whether Dylan's behavior matched the clinical definition. Fisher reminded the jury of her own expert, Dr. Knowles, who'd testified that Dylan's behavior showed compartmentalization rather than dissociation, a conscious psychological strategy that demonstrated awareness and control rather than a break from reality. The prosecution closing concluded with the Game Boy, which Fisher held up before the jury. She described Dylan sitting in that house surrounded by the corpses of his family, playing Michael's most treasured possession, catching the rare Pokemon that Michael had been hunting for, and saving his game at 8:47 p.m. with multiple deliberate button presses that proved he was present and aware. Fisher asked the jury, "Does this look like trauma? Does this look like someone whose mind has broken? Or does this look like someone who killed 3 people and then spent the next 36 hours doing exactly what he wanted to do, freed from the family he'd decided to eliminate?" She argued that the evidence overwhelmingly showed the latter, that Dylan had made a choice to commit murder and had never shown a moment of genuine remorse. Fisher's final words to the jury were about justice for the victims. She reminded them that Ryan Wilson, whatever his faults as a father, had been a human being who'd been shot in the back of the head while watching television. That Patricia Martinez Wilson, whatever mistakes she'd made in failing to protect Dylan, had been a human being who'd been shot while trying to flee. And most of all, that Michael Wilson, an innocent 9-year-old child who'd never hurt anyone, who'd loved his big brother and looked up to him, had been shot in the head while he slept. Fisher argued that these 3 people deserved justice, that their deaths mattered, and that justice required holding Dylan accountable for the deliberate, calculated choices he'd made on September 14, 2002. She asked the jury to return verdicts of guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. Judge Hardin spent 2 hours instructing the jury on the law, explaining the elements of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and manslaughter, and the various mental states required for each charge. She explained that they must consider each victim separately, that they could reach different verdicts for different counts if they believed the evidence supported such a finding. She instructed them that Dylan's age could be considered as a factor in determining his mental state, but did not automatically negate the specific intent required for first-degree murder. And she told them that if they had reasonable doubt about any element of the charges, they must find Dylan not guilty of that charge, but if the evidence proved his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, they must return a guilty verdict regardless of their personal feelings about the appropriateness of prosecuting a 13-year-old as an adult. The jury began deliberations at 2:15 p.m. on April 16, 2003, and the wait began. Dylan was returned to the county jail, his attorneys went back to their offices to anxiously await the verdict, and the courtroom emptied of everyone except reporters who maintained a vigil outside. The first day of deliberations passed without a verdict, then a second day, and then a third. On April 19th, the jury sent out a note asking to review the Game Boy evidence and Dr. Jennings's testimony about dissociation, suggesting they were grappling with the question of Dylan's mental state during the murders. On April 20th, they asked to see the crime scene photographs again and to review Dr. Knowles's testimony, suggesting they were reconsidering the evidence from both sides. On April 21, 2003, after 5 days, and approximately 31 hours of deliberation, the jury sent a note to Judge Hardin indicating they had reached verdicts on all counts. The courthouse erupted in activity as word spread, with reporters rushing to claim seats, attorneys being called back from their offices, and Dylan being transported from the jail. Eleanor Martinez arrived clutching her rosary beads, while Marcus Wilson and his family took their seats on the opposite side of the courtroom. As Judge Hardin took the bench and brought the jury into the courtroom, the tension was suffocating. The jury foreman, a 54-year-old accountant named James Richardson, stood when Judge Hardin asked if the jury had reached verdicts. Richardson's hands trembled slightly as he held the verdict forms, and his voice was barely audible when he began to read. On count 1, the murder of Ryan Wilson, guilty of first-degree murder. On count 2, the murder of Patricia Martinez Wilson, guilty of first-degree murder. On count 3, the murder of Michael Wilson, guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in gasps and sobs, with Eleanor Martinez collapsing forward in her seat, crying uncontrollably while Marcus Wilson and his family embraced, tears streaming down their faces. Dylan sat motionless at the defense table, his expression blank, showing no reaction as his attorneys put their hands on his shoulders in a gesture of comfort or restraint. Judge Hardin polled the jury individually, asking each juror if these were their verdicts, and all 12 affirmed that they were. Several jurors were openly crying as they answered, the emotional toll of the deliberations evident on their faces. After the polling was complete, Hardin thanked the jury for their service and excused them, setting a sentencing hearing for June 2, 2003. Dylan was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, still showing no emotion, while his grandmother's wails echoed through the courthouse. The verdicts meant that Dylan Martinez, at age 13, had been convicted as an adult of 3 counts of first-degree murder, and he now faced a mandatory sentence of life in prison. The 6 weeks between the verdicts and the sentencing hearing felt interminable for everyone involved in the case. Under Colorado law, Dylan's conviction on 3 counts of first-degree murder carried a mandatory minimum sentence of life in prison. But Judge Marcia Hardin retained discretion on one critical question: whether to impose life with the possibility of parole after 40 years or life without any possibility of parole, a sentence that would ensure Dylan died in prison. Both sides filed extensive briefs arguing for their preferred sentencing outcomes, with the defense presenting a 127-page mitigation memorandum documenting every aspect of Dylan's abuse and arguing that condemning a 13-year-old to die in prison violated evolving standards of decency and basic human rights. The prosecution's sentencing memorandum was shorter, but no less forceful, arguing that the calculated nature of Dylan's planning, the brutality of the murders, and particularly the execution of a sleeping 9-year-old child, justified the harshest available sentence. Amanda Fisher wrote, "This court must send a clear message that age does not grant immunity from consequences, that even children who commit monstrous acts must face justice, and that the victims of crime matter regardless of the age of their killer." Michael Wilson was 9 years old. Dylan Martinez is 13 years old. Both are children, but only one is alive today because the other made a deliberate choice to kill him. That choice must have consequences that reflect the permanent harm it caused. The sentencing hearing began on June 2, 2003, with Judge Hardin's courtroom packed to capacity once again. The hearing would be the final opportunity for both sides to present evidence and argument about the appropriate sentence, and it would also be the opportunity for victim impact statements from family members of the deceased. Marcus Wilson had requested permission to speak on behalf of his brother's family, and Eleanor Martinez had requested permission to speak on behalf of Dylan, creating the prospect of a courtroom confrontation between the two sides of this shattered family that would be the final chapter before sentencing was imposed. The defense presented its mitigation case first, calling many of the same witnesses who'd testified at trial about Dylan's abuse and mental health issues. Dr. Jennings returned to testify about Dylan's progress in therapy since his conviction, describing a boy who was beginning to process what he'd done and show signs of genuine remorse. Jennings testified that in their most recent session, Dylan had cried for the first time when discussing Michael's death, saying, "I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't want to hurt any of them. I just wanted it to stop." Jennings argued that this emerging capacity for empathy and remorse demonstrated Dylan's potential for rehabilitation and suggested that life without parole would be giving up on that potential prematurely. Eleanor Martinez testified again, this time bringing with her a collection of letters that Dylan had written to her from jail over the past 6 months. With Judge Hardin's permission, she read portions of these letters aloud, and they painted a picture of a child grappling with guilt and trauma. In one letter, dated April 28th, Dylan had written, "Grandma, I think about Michael every day. I see his face when I close my eyes. I know sorry doesn't mean anything, but I am sorry. I wish I could take it back. I wish I'd just run away like you told me I could. I don't understand why I did what I did." Eleanor wept as she read these words, and several people in the courtroom gallery were visibly moved, though Marcus Wilson and his family sat stone-faced. The defense presented testimony from juvenile justice experts who argued that sentencing a 13-year-old to life without parole was virtually unprecedented in American jurisprudence and violated international treaties that the United States had signed prohibiting cruel and unusual punishment of children. Professor Janet Morrison from Harvard Law School testified that only 6 other defendants in American history had been sentenced to life without parole for crimes committed at age 13 or younger, and that in all 6 cases there had been subsequent legal challenges arguing that the sentences violated constitutional protections. Morrison argued that Dylan's sentence would likely be the subject of decades of appeals and might ultimately be overturned, making it wiser for Judge Hardin to impose life with parole eligibility after 40 years, ensuring Dylan would spend most of his life in prison while preserving the possibility of eventual release if he demonstrated rehabilitation. The prosecution's sentencing case focused on the victims and the permanent harm Dylan's actions had caused. Amanda Fisher called Michael Wilson's soccer coach, who testified about the vibrant, happy child he'd known, about Michael's dreams of playing professional soccer someday, about the hole his death had left in their team and their community. Fisher called Michael's best friend, a 10-year-old named Tyler Chen, who testified through tears about missing his friend and not understanding why Dylan had killed him. Tyler said, "Michael told me his big brother was the coolest person ever. He wanted to be just like Dylan when he grew up. Why would Dylan kill someone who loved him so much?" The question hung in the courtroom, unanswerable and devastating. Fisher presented evidence of the ongoing trauma that the murders had caused for the extended family. Ryan Wilson's elderly parents testified about losing their son and grandson, about the nightmares that woke them nightly, about the fear and suspicion that now colored their view of the world. Patricia Martinez Wilson's sister testified about Dylan's betrayal, about how Patricia had defended him against Ryan's harshest impulses, had tried to protect him in her limited way, and had been killed for her efforts. The cumulative weight of this testimony created a portrait of devastation that radiated out from Dylan's actions, touching dozens of lives and destroying the sense of safety and order that had defined their community. The victim impact statements were scheduled for June 4th, the second day of the sentencing hearing, and they would become the most emotionally charged moments of the entire proceedings. Marcus Wilson spoke first, taking the podium with Michael's teddy bear in his hands, the same bear that Eleanor had clutched during her trial testimony. Marcus spoke for 15 minutes, his voice shaking with emotion, but never breaking, describing his brother Ryan, his sister-in-law Patricia, and most of all, his nephew Michael. He showed the court photographs of Michael at various ages, from his birth to his final birthday, just 3 months before his death. And he described a child full of life and potential who'd been robbed of his future by someone he trusted and loved. Marcus's statement became raw and angry when he addressed Dylan directly, turning to look at the boy sitting at the defense table flanked by his attorneys. "You took everything from him," Marcus said, his voice rising. "Michael was 9 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. He wanted to be a soccer player. He wanted to go to college. He wanted to get married and have kids someday. You took all of that away because you were angry at your stepfather. But Michael wasn't your stepfather. Michael was an innocent child who loved you, and you shot him in the head while he slept. You didn't give him a chance to run, to hide, to beg for his life. You just executed him." Several jurors from the trial were present in the courtroom gallery, and many were crying openly as Marcus spoke. Marcus concluded his statement by addressing Judge Hardin directly and asking her to impose life without parole. "Your Honor, Dylan Martinez planned these murders for weeks. He researched how to get away with murder. He wrote in his journal about the necessity of killing Michael. He showed no remorse for 36 hours while he played video games in a house full of corpses. And even now, the remorse he claims to feel is just words on paper. I've sat through this entire trial and heard every excuse, every justification, every reason why we should feel sorry for him. But I keep coming back to one fact. Michael is dead, and Dylan is the one who killed him. That deserves the harshest punishment available under law. Please, Your Honor, make sure Dylan Martinez never has the chance to hurt anyone else. Make sure he spends the rest of his life in prison, because that's the only way my nephew's death will have any meaning." Eleanor Martinez spoke next, and her statement took the opposite position, pleading for mercy and the possibility of eventual redemption for her grandson. Eleanor described visiting Dylan in jail every week since his arrest, watching him struggle to understand what he'd done, seeing glimpses of the sweet boy he'd been before Ryan Wilson destroyed him. She read more letters from Dylan, including one where he'd written, "I know I deserve to be punished. I know I can never make this right. But Grandma, I'm only 13. If I have to spend the rest of my life in prison, what's the point of even trying to be better? What's the point of feeling sorry if it doesn't matter?" Eleanor argued that this letter showed Dylan's capacity for growth and change, that he was beginning to develop a moral consciousness that had been beaten out of him during his years with Ryan. Eleanor's statement became a direct challenge to the prosecution's narrative about Dylan's character. She argued that the boy who'd planned those murders wasn't the real Dylan, but rather a traumatized, broken version of him created by years of abuse and suffering. "Your Honor," Eleanor said, "I'm not asking you to excuse what Dylan did. I'm not asking you to say it was okay or understandable. I'm asking you to recognize that he's a child, that children can change and grow in ways that adults can't, and that sentencing him to die in prison is giving up on the possibility that he could ever become the good person he was meant to be. Ryan Wilson destroyed one life when he abused Dylan. Please don't let Ryan destroy a second life by making Dylan's punishment so harsh that he has no hope of ever being anything other than a murderer." The final statement came from Amanda Fisher on behalf of the prosecution, and she used her time to systematically rebut the defense's arguments for a life with parole sentence. Fisher argued that Dylan's letters expressing remorse were self-serving attempts to manipulate the court rather than genuine evidence of transformation. She pointed out that Dylan had never voluntarily apologized to the victims' families, had never offered to waive his appeals to save them the trauma of reliving these events, had never done anything that demonstrated genuine acceptance of responsibility beyond words written when he knew they might help his sentencing outcome. Fisher addressed Eleanor Martinez's statement with visible sympathy but firm disagreement. "Mrs. Martinez, I understand that you love your grandson and that you want to believe he can be redeemed," Fisher said. But this court's responsibility is not to Dylan Martinez, it's to justice and to public safety. Your grandson didn't just kill in the heat of passion. He planned these murders for weeks. He researched methods. He waited for the right moment. He executed 3 people, including a sleeping child. And then he played video games and ate McDonald's while their bodies decomposed in the house around him. That's not the behavior of someone who made one terrible mistake. That's the behavior of someone who is fundamentally dangerous. Fisher concluded by arguing that life without parole was not about revenge or giving up on Dylan, but rather about acknowledging the severity of what he'd done and ensuring he never had the opportunity to harm anyone else. Michael Wilson will never grow up, Fisher said. He'll never play soccer again, never go to college, never get married, never have children of his own. His potential was extinguished at age 9 by someone he trusted and loved. Dylan Martinez deserves to face a future that reflects that reality. He deserves to spend the rest of his life contemplating what he took from Michael and from this community. And society deserves the protection that comes from knowing he will never be released. Judge Hardin announced that she would take the sentencing arguments under advisement and would issue her decision on June 9th, giving her 5 days to review all the materials and prepare her sentencing order. Those 5 days were agonizing for both sides, with media speculation reaching fever pitch about which way Hardin would rule. Legal experts were divided, with some arguing that Hardin's reputation as a tough law and order judge made life without parole likely, while others suggested that her careful approach to the law might lead her to impose life with parole eligibility to avoid the appellate issues that Professor Morrison had raised. On June 9, 2003, Judge Marcia Hardin's courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds outside and media from around the world waiting for what would be a historic sentencing decision. Hardin took the bench precisely at 9:00 a.m., her expression unreadable, and announced that she would be reading her sentencing decision from a prepared statement. What followed was a 22-minute speech that would become one of the most quoted and controversial judicial statements in modern American history. A speech that attempted to grapple with impossible questions about childhood, evil, responsibility, and justice. Judge Hardin began by acknowledging the difficulty of the case and the legitimate arguments on both sides. She stated that she'd spent countless hours reviewing the trial transcript, the sentencing memoranda, and the applicable law, and that she'd struggled more with this decision than any other in her 12 years on the bench. She acknowledged Dylan's youth, his abuse, and the ways that the child services system had failed him. But she stated that those factors, however mitigating, could not erase or excuse the deliberate, calculated nature of his crimes and the permanent harm he'd caused. Hardin methodically addressed each of the defense's arguments for a life with parole sentence. On the question of Dylan's age and brain development, she stated, "This court recognizes that 13-year-olds are not adults and that their brains are still developing, but this court also recognizes that 13-year-olds understand right from wrong, understand that murder is permanent, and understand that actions have consequences." Dylan Martinez demonstrated sophisticated abstract reasoning in planning these murders. He researched methods, he considered legal consequences, he weighed his options, and made deliberate choices. The defense cannot have it both ways, arguing that Dylan's planning shows diminished capacity while simultaneously arguing that he was too traumatized to understand what he was doing. On the question of abuse as a mitigating factor, Hardin stated, "This court has deep sympathy for what Dylan Martinez suffered at the hands of his stepfather. The evidence of abuse is overwhelming and heartbreaking. But this court must also recognize that millions of children suffer abuse, and the vast majority of them do not respond by murdering their families. Dylan had options. He had a grandmother who offered to take him in." He had teachers and counselors he could have confided in. He had a phone in his room and could have called 911 at any time. He chose murder instead of help, and that choice cannot be excused by the abuse he suffered. On the question of Michael Wilson's death specifically, Hardin's statement became passionate and angry. The defense has spent considerable effort trying to explain away the murder of 9-year-old Michael Wilson, she said. They've argued that Dylan killed Michael because he was a witness, or because he was afraid Michael would grow up to be like his father, or because Dylan was in a dissociative state and wasn't thinking clearly. But this court finds all of those explanations insufficient. Michael Wilson was a sleeping child who'd never harmed Dylan in any way. Dylan walked into that child's room, pressed a gun against his temple, and pulled the trigger. There is no psychological explanation, no trauma defense, no mitigating factor that justifies or excuses that act. It was murder, plain and simple, of the most vulnerable and innocent victim imaginable. Judge Hardin turned to look directly at Dylan, who sat at the defense table with his head bowed, and her statement became a direct condemnation that would echo through courtrooms and news broadcasts for years to come. Dylan Martinez, you made yourself the judge, jury, and executioner of your family, Hardin said, her voice rising. You decided that your stepfather deserved to die. You decided that your mother deserved to die for failing to protect you. And you decided that a 9-year-old child deserved to die to prevent him from growing up to be like his father. You arrogated to yourself the power of life and death, and you exercised that power with chilling efficiency, and then, having killed 3 people, you spent the next 36 hours eating McDonald's and playing with your dead brother's toys as if nothing had happened. Hardin's statement reached its climax with words that would become infamous and spark immediate controversy. Your childhood trauma does not override the 3 lives you extinguished. Your age does not excuse your calculated planning and deliberate execution of these murders. You made yourself the executioner, and in the eyes of this court, your life is worthless. The courtroom gasped at these words, with defense attorneys immediately making notes for their inevitable appeal, but Hardin continued without pause. You took Michael Wilson's life when he had everything ahead of him. You took your mother's life when she was trying, however imperfectly, to raise you. You took your stepfather's life when he was watching television in his own home. Those lives had value. Those lives mattered. And your actions have consequences. Judge Hardin then announced her sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole on all 3 counts to run concurrently. Dylan Martinez, at age 13, had become the youngest person in Colorado history to receive this sentence. Hardin stated that this sentence was mandated by the severity of the crimes, the evidence of premeditation, and the need to protect society from someone who had demonstrated such a profound capacity for violence. She acknowledged that the sentence would be appealed and that appellate courts might ultimately modify or overturn it, but she stated her firm belief that it was the appropriate sentence given the evidence presented and the applicable law. Eleanor Martinez collapsed in the courtroom gallery, wailing, "No, no, no," while Marcus Wilson and his family embraced, some crying in relief, others maintaining the stone-faced composure they'd shown throughout the proceedings. Dylan showed no immediate reaction, sitting motionless at the defense table as bailiffs approached to take him back into custody. As he was led from the courtroom in shackles, Dylan turned briefly to look at his grandmother, and for the first time in the entire trial, observers saw what appeared to be genuine emotion on his face. Tears streaming down his cheeks as he mouthed the words, "I'm sorry." The aftermath of the sentencing was immediate and fierce. Civil rights organizations condemned Judge Hardin's statement that Dylan's life was worthless, arguing that no judge should ever make such a declaration about any human being, let alone a child. The American Civil Liberties Union announced it would be filing an appeal within 30 days, arguing that the sentence violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, and that Judge Hardin's intemperate language demonstrated bias that invalidated the entire proceeding. Mental health advocates argued that the sentence ignored everything modern psychology knew about childhood trauma and brain development, that it represented a regression to medieval concepts of punishment that viewed children as small adults fully responsible for their actions. But public opinion polling showed that the majority of Americans, and particularly Coloradans, supported Judge Hardin's decision. A poll conducted by the Denver Post in the week after sentencing showed that 68% of Colorado residents believed life without parole was the appropriate sentence for Dylan Martinez, with only 24% believing he should have received life with parole eligibility. The comment section on news articles about the case were filled with arguments that Dylan's planning and the murder of Michael specifically demonstrated a level of evil that transcended his age, and that society had a right to permanently remove such individuals from its midst, regardless of their potential for rehabilitation. Dylan Martinez was transferred to a special unit for youthful offenders at Colorado State Penitentiary, where he would spend his teenage years before being moved to the general adult population at age 18. He would spend 23 hours per day in his cell, with 1 hour for recreation in a small enclosed yard. He would have no contact with other inmates except during his recreation hour. He would be allowed weekly visits from his grandmother Eleanor, who vowed to visit him every week for as long as she lived, but no other family members ever visited. He would have access to educational programs through correspondence courses, and according to prison reports, he would eventually earn his GED and begin taking college courses through a distance learning program. The appeals process would consume years, with Dylan's attorneys filing motions in state and federal courts arguing that his sentence violated constitutional protections and that Judge Hardin's bias had denied him a fair proceeding. In 2005, the Colorado Supreme Court would uphold his conviction and sentence in a 4-3 decision, with the dissenting justices arguing that life without parole for a 13-year-old represented cruel and unusual punishment regardless of the heinousness of the crime. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court would rule in Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles violated the Eighth Amendment, but would specify that discretionary sentences, like Dylan's, where a judge considered the defendant's youth and other mitigating factors, remained constitutional. Dylan's attorneys would file for resentencing under Miller, but Judge Hardin, still on the bench, would review the case again and reimpose the same sentence, stating that nothing in the Supreme Court's ruling changed her assessment that life without parole was appropriate for Dylan's crimes. The case of Dylan Martinez would become a standard reference point in debates about juvenile justice, brain development, trauma, and the limits of rehabilitation. Law schools would teach it as an example of the tension between retributive and rehabilitative theories of punishment. Psychology programs would analyze it as a case study in the effects of prolonged childhood abuse. Victim advocacy groups would point to it as proof that youth should not automatically insulate criminals from the consequences of their acts, while child welfare organizations would point to it as evidence of how catastrophically the system can fail vulnerable children. Years later, when someone would mention the Dylan Martinez case, people would immediately know they were talking about impossible questions of justice, mercy, childhood, and evil that had no satisfying answers. Michael Wilson would have turned 21 in 2014, old enough to legally drink, to vote, to be finishing college, and starting his adult life. Instead, his grave in Aspen Cemetery received weekly visits from his uncle Marcus, who would leave fresh flowers and sometimes sit, talking to the headstone about what might have been. Ryan Wilson and Patricia Martinez Wilson rested in graves nearby. their headstones bearing only their names and dates, the circumstances of their deaths too painful to memorialize in stone. And Dylan Martinez would sit in a cell in Colorado State Penitentiary, serving a sentence that would never end, contemplating 3 lives he'd taken and a 4th life, his own, that had been forfeited at age 13 in a suburban house in Aspen, where bloodstains had long since been cleaned away, but where the echoes of gunshots would reverberate forever.